Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Gnostic Media's UnSpun episode 100. We made it, the big 100. And I'm super excited. We got a knock out of the park show tonight. Jacob is back. No pressure on you, Jacob. But, the last show with you was so good. It was just out of the park, man. And, rock some people's worlds with that. So tonight we're going to go deeper still. And thanks everyone who donated and supported the show over the last week. Can't do it without you. January is always a slow month. I really appreciate people's donations because it's slow after the holidays. Also, Jacob, you wanted to make a mention about that as well.
Yeah, there are a few people that were able to send a charitable contribution to my research, and I'd like to name them. Just a first name, just because I haven't had time to write many emails lately. Richie, Edward, Eric, Patrick, Matthew, and Tripp. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Every little bit helps, and it's going towards a good cause, and will hopefully produce much more in the future. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks again, everyone who supported the show and all of this. We can't do it without you. We try to bring out the best information, even though sometimes the dirties slip through, but we do our best to expose this whole agenda. And hopefully with the trivium and all, you have the tools to find your way through it, even if we drop the ball on occasion and let somebody through. But anyway, I'm going to pass the floor over to you because we have a lot of ground to cover tonight, and this is a deep show. Scaliger, Notatus, Hallucinatio, Scaligeri, Part 6, and more on the faking of history, covering up Tartary, creating the bogus Dark Age, how they did it. And as this goes, we're starting to see connections all over the place throughout history, and people's agendas covering this up become so simple to see once you understand this history. So, all right, Jacob, run with it.
Just kind of right off what you were just going with there, it's almost like putting together a puzzle, and you have all the different pieces scattered all over the table. Some of them are upside down, some of them are right side up, and all you see are colors. And then as you start to grab the pieces, you kind of see the borders and the outlines. You just got to piece it bit by bit by bit, and you build into the center, and all of a sudden the image starts to come into view. And that seems to be what's happening as I go through this research. And I hope people are having fun as they go along the ride, as we pick up those puzzle pieces, examine them, and try to find them the correct place to put them. So
and adding to that, what I find interesting is that, we are all, you're adding pieces to the puzzle, and then we're getting other pieces elsewhere that are also filling in the same picture that you can tell they've managed to keep covered up for several hundred years.
We're at Grandma and Grandpa's dining table, and we're all helping out putting together that big puzzle.
Yeah, that great big one over the holiday weekend or whatever. It's like, all right, here we go. So let's fill it in.
So I thought I'd start off with a couple of quotes. First one will be coming from the 9th edition Britannica on Joseph Scaliger. Some of you might remember it from part 4. For the first 7 years of his residence at Leiden, his reputation was at its highest point. His literary dictatorship was unquestioned. It was greater in kind and in extent than that of any man since the revival of letters, greater even than that of Erasmus had been. From his throne at Leiden, he ruled the learned world, and a word from him could make or mar a rising reputation. Keep that in mind. The electric force of his genius drew to him all the rising talent of the Republic. He was surrounded by young men eager to listen to and profit by his conversation. And he enjoyed nothing better than to discuss with them the books they were reading and the men who wrote them, and to open up by his suggestive remarks the true methods and objects of philological and historical study. His suggestive remarks, the true methods and objects of philological study. So interesting, suggestive and truth. I don't think you can suggest truth. You generally show the object and its truth. Anyway, he encouraged Grotius, who is the author of the Law of War and Peace, when he was only a youth of 16 to edit Capella, the early death of the younger Dauza, he wept as that of a beloved son. Daniel Heinsius, from being his favorite pupil, became his most intimate friend. But Scaliger had made numerous enemies. He hated ignorance, but he hated still more half-learning, and most of all, dishonesty in argument or in quotation. And the second quote is from Vossius in The Life of Junius. The mighty Scaliger, dictator of the Republic of Letters, whom the mighty Scaliger, dictator of the Republic of Letters, whom the literati willingly consider as their monarch. And that is from a General Dictionary, Historical and Critical, from 1734 to 41.
And what page are we on? Sorry.
We're still on page 1. We're just about to go to the bottom of it.
All right. Yeah. And could you mention when we're going to a page, just so I know when to switch it on the screen for folks?
Yeah, sure. So,
I'm not following along.
Yeah, we're at the bottom of the second half of page 1.
No problem.
So we will begin tonight by continuing our look into Marcus Terentius Varro, whose chronology sits as the foundation of the Roman timeline and acts as the primary source used by Joseph Scaliger. We will look back on some evidence presented in part 5 and look to new material tonight on Joseph Scaliger and his academic dictatorship. So what is chronology? Chambers' Information for the People defines chronology as from chronos, time, and logos, discourse, is literally the doctrine of time, the science which treats of its various divisions and of the order and succession of events. The chronologist has thus a threefold duty to perform, namely, to assign a measure to the interval which elapses between the recurrence of any natural event, to determine certain points or epochs from which to date occurrences, whether preceding or succeeding that epoch, and lastly, dating from any given epoch to arrange in due order all facts and phenomena which may be considered of importance. And that came from my 1848 copy. Noah Webster, in his dictionary from 1828, defines chronology as the science of time, the method of measuring or computing time by regular divisions or periods according to the revolutions of the sun or moon, of ascertaining the true periods or years when past events or transactions took place, and arranging them in their proper order according to their dates. And here's a little quote that he has at the bottom of his entry. If history without chronology is dark and confused, chronology without history is dry and insipid. That's from Abiel Holmes, who is, interestingly enough, the father of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., and the grandfather of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. So now we kind of have a framework and a grounding of what chronology is and what we're going to be kind of investigating today. And this all starts with Varronian chronology as we study Joseph Scaliger. And it's important that we go to the primary first as far as where this all begins. So we start with Varro. So from the article Chronology from the 9th edition Britannica, we're going to take a look at that and see what exactly we are going to investigate. The most important of these systems in what we call ancient times were the Babylonian, the Greek, and the Roman. The Jews had no general era, properly so called. In the history of Babylonia, the fixed point from which time was reckoned was the era of Nebuchadnezzar, 747 BC. Among the Greeks, the reckoning was by Olympiads, the point of departure being the year in which Corybus was victor in the Olympic Games, 776 BC. The Roman chronology started from the foundation of the city, the year of which, however, was variously given by different authors. The most generally adopted was that assigned by Varro, 753 BC. It is noteworthy how nearly these three great epochs approach each other, all lying near the middle of the 8th century BC. But it is to be remembered that the beginning of the era and its adoption and use as such are not the same thing, nor are they necessarily synchronous. Of the three ancient eras above spoken of, the earliest is that of the Olympiads, next of the foundation of Rome, and the latest the era of Nebuchadnezzar. But in order of adoption and actual usage, the last is first, that being Nebuchadnezzar. It is believed to have been in use from the year of its origin. It is not known when the Romans began to use their era. The Olympiads were not in current use until about the middle of the 3rd century BC, when Timaeus, as already mentioned, set the example of reckoning by them. Livy, in general, adheres to the epoch of Cato, though he sometimes follows that of Fabius Pictor. Cicero follows the account of Varro, which is also, in general, adopted by Pliny. Dionysius of Halicarnassus follows Cato. Modern chronologers, for the most part, adopt the account of Varro, which is supported by a passage of Censorinus, or it is stated that the 991st year of Rome commenced when the festival of the Palilia and the consulship of Ulpius and Pontianus, those are hard to pronounce. Now, the consulship corresponded with the 238th year of our era. Therefore, deducting 238 from 991, we have 753 to denote the era before Christ. The Palilia commenced on the 21st of April, and all the accounts agree in regarding that day as the epoch of the foundation of Rome. And again, that is chronology from the Encyclopedia Britannica 9th edition. So as we were kind of going through the study, one of the things that kind of interested us was the mathematician and historian Professor Anatoly Fomenko. And I thought what I'd do today was start to incorporate some of the passages from his work to kind of elucidate kind of where we're coming from as far as modern researchers looking at this history and why it is that we're looking into it.
You know, and it's probably important to point out that Fomenko is probably one of the most viciously attacked scholars that I've ever seen out there. And the more I look at it, at his research and check the citations, and you as well, the more we realize that the attacks against him are entirely unfounded, and that, you know, the real reason why that they're attacking him is more because they're afraid of this information getting out and taking hold, rather than him being a crackpot nutcase, as they want everybody to believe. It's like, you know, when I came out exposing Wasson and the entire field of ethnobotany and ethnomycology, and all these nut jobs came out attacking me, and then we exposed the entire field out there, and you still have nut jobs running around trying to claim that McKenna wasn't an agent and stuff like that. You know, and you know, now today it's a given. We know the agenda. We can see it. You know, so it's clear why it's important to suppress Fomenko's work, because the ramifications of his work are huge. And then your research is based almost entirely independent from his. You didn't use really any of the same citations that I've seen. You did check a few of them, but you went way deeper in other directions, confirming it. And so when we go in an entirely different direction and find the same things for confirmation, it's more evidence that he's correct. And, you know, what we're beginning to see, this puzzle picture that we were talking about at the start of the show, what's beginning to come clear is that it's Tartary, and what happened to Tartary, and the breakup of the quote-unquote 12 tribes, or the 12 hordes, and how they all went their different directions, and then how the Theosophists et al., from Scaliger, Theosophist, on to, you know, modern-day Judases, you have this whole cover-up of the, you know, the 12 tribes, Tartary, what the books of the 12 tribes were, how many books there were, all of this stuff. And, it, you know, the picture is becoming more and more clear as we go. And we haven't even really began to even discuss, you know, some of this stuff yet, you know. I mean, it's like we're just barely scraping the surface, folks.
Yeah, well, in the study of history, it's a vast ocean of information that's out there. And you just kind of lay your net out there and you try to pull as much information as you can in there and make sense out of it. And you have to try to find the logical conclusions as to where they go and make sure it's valid.
Yeah, you know, and the trivium is absolutely essential in researching this stuff, because then, you know, once you become fluid with the trivium, it really shows you where to look and who's lying, what lie they used. And then once you understand these things, then it's a simple matter of reverse engineering the lie. You know, it's like they love to reverse engineer stuff. Well, we reverse engineer their lies. That's what the trivium allows you to do, and it allows you to see the truth via certainty, at least, you know, based on all of the available evidence there on what really took place. And when somebody else comes along from a different direction like you, and we're investigating, we start off by investigating Coconut Moon, of all things, and end up exposing this whole, you know, 400-year-old scandal and realizing from an entirely different direction that Fomenko is correct, you know, and like I said, the evidence just keeps building and building. It's not getting less and less. We're not finding mistakes. You know, we're predicting more and more often where evidence should be, and we're finding it there.
It's just like any solid investigation. Every single piece of information should produce a lead, and you follow that lead, and you know you're onto something if the trail continues from that lead onto somewhere else. And it just seems to be the experience over and over and over again. Is once I find some more information, you know, more doors open. And I have to follow. You know,
and people should get this, because the trivium is essentially who, what, where, when, why, and how. And every single CSI, you know, FBI investigation TV show, every one of them that I think I've ever seen, even Dexter, they would put up on the wall who, what, where, when, why, and how. And this is how you start off all investigations. And like you said, exactly that process you go through, and it corkscrews down so that, you know where you need more information in certain areas. If you're discussing, you know, if you're fixing somebody's car, you don't need the whole history of spark plugs. If you're a professor at an auto mechanics school, you're going to want the history of the spark plug and to be able to pass that information down. So you corkscrew into the information at a needed level until all contradictions are, disappear. A contradiction isn't, when you throw up your arms into the air and say, opinions are like a-holes, we can't know anything. You know, what it means is that you need to dig down further into the information until no more contradictions exist. And when you get to the bottom of that and there's nothing left, but that one point, that's truth, and it's that simple.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's I think that kind of gives a little foundation for where we're coming from and where we're going to be going tonight. So let's go back to Professor Fomenko. So this is Professor Fomenko on Varro and the Foundation Stones of Chronology. And he titles this The Ancient Count of Years from the Foundation of the City ad Urbe Condita. This chronology is presumed originated around 753 BC, but then we are told that this date was established by Varro, a Roman in the 1st century, which allegedly postdates the foundation of Rome in Italy, according to the Scaligerian chronology. The count of years, quote, from the foundation of the city, end quote, ends in the alleged 3rd century AD, namely in the decade of 250 to 260 AD. The time of civil wars in Rome, or the middle of the alleged 3rd century AD, excuse me, that kind of came out disjointed. AD Blair reports most of the chronicles start counting years from the foundation of Rome. We recall that the Scaligerian identification of the, quote, city as the Italian Rome founded in the alleged year 753 BC is only a hypothesis. It is noteworthy that the count of years, quote, from the foundation of the city, end quote, in Scaligerian chronology comes to an end just at the junction of 2 duplicate empires, the Second Roman Empire and the Third Roman Empire. Now, there's a lot of information there that people probably would like us to dive in and go a lot further into, but those are dedicated shows in and of themselves. But it just gives us a little bit of an idea of where we're coming from with Varro and the foundation of the city of Rome.
Let me interject right here and just explain what a duplicate empire is for those who may not understand the concept, because what Fomenko discovered, and this is, when you realize how simple it is to fake chronology, and you have all of these Saturn worshippers that Saturn, Father Time, Kronos worship, then you get the gag. But so in duplicate empires, what you have, let's say, is these scribes at a certain period, let's say it's the 1600s, and they'll take a story of their own king and, just pick some local, kingdom in Europe at the time, and they write down a true history of what it is, and then they change the name of the king, and maybe they change the city, and a few of the, they might change the order of things around or something. And then what they'll do is they throw that back into history at intervals of 333, 1052, or 1800 years. And so then what happens is when you plug the information into a computer database and you use, say, 35 data points, like these specific things happen, the computer goes through and it looks for, okay, a volcano happened and there was a king who stubbed his toe on a Friday, and, a princess who did this, and you put all of these points in the database, and what happens is it reveals duplicate empires and epics that, one of them is the real one, and then the scribes changed and altered to fill in this black hole, this dark age that, excuse the pun, they're always with these dark sex jokes, the dark hole, the Big Bang in the black hole, the Dark Ages, this kind of stuff. So they fill in this dark age with these fake copy epics and kingdoms and empires, etc. So this is how they're duplicated and covered up. Sorry, go ahead. I just thought that would be good for people to understand.
Yeah, that's a good introduction, I suppose, to how Professor Fomenko analyzes it, because he does take statistics and information and has a lot of graphs and charts and shows how they overlap. And it's pretty interesting and worthy of a lot of study.
And to Professor Fomenko's credit, he's got, 30, and this is, the Russian professor of mathematics at Moscow State University. He's got 30 books in English covering this topic and nearly 100 in Russian covering it. So, it's a vast, vast subject.
It's prolific. It's quite extraordinary how much he's put together with he and his
I'm always amused at these clowns that, dismiss his whole body of work by a single paragraph, or ridiculing it when they haven't read it, and they'll like cite the Loeb classics or something as like evidence that, hey, look at these classics funded by the banking families who created the fraud as evidence that the fraud didn't happen.
Yeah, you really need to go to the source instead of, watching YouTube documentaries and third-hand sources and never actually, reading the actual book.
Yeah. That's just lazy pseudo-intellectualism at that point,
Well, it's captious and fallacious reasoning, but...
Well, as Noah Webster would have called it, yes.
So let's look at a more broader general look now at Varro and look at how Wikipedia likes to present this information, because it's quite interesting who they source for it. So in chronology, for the early Republic, this article observes the Varronian Chronology, established by the historian Marcus Terentius Varro, who calculated that Rome was founded in what is now called the year 753 BC. The founding of the city was traditionally observed on the Palila, a festival occurring on April 21st. This becoming the year 1 ad urbe condita, or AUC. The Republic was established in 245 AUC, or 509 BC. Although other ancient historians gave different years, Varro's chronology was the most widely accepted. It was used in the Fasti Capitolini, and its use by Censorinus brought it to the attention of Joseph Scaliger, who helped popularize its use in modern times. And there's 2 footnotes there, 11 and 12. And footnote 11 is from Anthony Grafton.
What page are we on? Sorry, I'm not...
We're 3 going into 4.
Okay.
So footnote 11 is from Anthony Grafton, fellow of the British Academy, and Noel Swerdlow in their Technical Chronology and Astrological History in Varro, Censorinus, and others from the Classical Quarterly. So it's just interesting that, as we're looking at this, we go back and we see that Joseph Scaliger is associated with the Fasti Capitolini, and it's Anthony Grafton who helps us out once again with nugget of information. And we'll start to look at that and try to verify that a little bit further back with our sources. So, as mentioned earlier on the use of the Fasti for the chronological dating of Rome, we see that Joseph Scaliger's chronology is associated with this piece. During his travels of nearly 30 years, decades in which little is known about Scaliger and his travel companion, who was de la Roche-Posay, Louis Chastanier de la Roche-Posay. It's a tough one to say. It's a tough guy to figure out, too, and get more information on. Started digging into him, but a lot of this info is in French. Some people have reached out to me about it, but I haven't had time to really organize and get those ideas out to them. So please, thank you for your interest.
Hey, I've had help from the French in the past where they actually went to the French National Museum and dug up rare documents and, published academic journals and stuff for me to expose another fraud that Wasson had committed,
That's absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
It's cool to know there's people out there that do that. That's really...
Yeah, well, it's like, when you do this, it's, somebody on the other side of the planet will be happy to help you out.
So
it's like somebody helping out with Coconut Moon, right?
Yeah. Look at that, right across the United States.
Right, there you go. All right,
straight from America's heartland. So during his travels of nearly 30 years, decades in which little's known about Scaliger and his travel companion, he spent his time scouring libraries and searching the landscape for supposed ancient inscriptions. We go into further detail on his work with inscriptions later on in this presentation. So the Fasti Consulares, this is from Wikipedia, were official chronicles in which years were denoted by the respective consuls and other magistrates, often with the principal events that happened during their consulates, but sometimes not. An example is the Fasti Capitolini, a modern name assigned because they were deposited in 1547 in the courtyard of Palazzo dei Conservatori on the Capitoline Hill on order of Alessandro Farnese, who kept them temporarily in his villa after their excavation from the Roman Forum in 1545 or 1546 and funded by Farnese. Michelangelo, who designed the complex of 3 palaces on the hill, also restored the tables of the Fasti. Now, we'll remember this information from the last episode, but it's important to go over this as we continue to build upon the information. So the Palazzo today is one of the Capitolini museums, which serve a double duty as museums and city government buildings. The Fasti are located in the Sala della Lupa, the same room as the bronze wolf. More pieces discovered after the Renaissance were placed with it. After. Amazing how many years go by and they still don't find anything. And then look at that. Inscriptions, artifacts. So continuing on, for imperial times, the dates of the consuls ordinari are far more certain than those of the suffecti, who were not recorded with the same attention as the eponymous magistrates. Their identification and dating is far more controversial, and despite the efforts of generations of scholars, gaps in coverage remain. Known consuls suffecti are shown with their known or reconstructed dates of tenure, which normally varied from 2 to 6 months. Although one suffect consul, Rosius Vergellus, is known to have held the fasces for a single day, October 31st AD 69. Where neither consul is known or inferred for a portion of the year, their names are omitted for convenience. If one consul can be named, but his colleague is unknown, the unnamed colleague is listed as Notatus. So now we're kind of looking here, we're seeing that Joseph Scaliger was involved with these inscriptions and was basing a lot of his chronology off of the Fasti Capitolini, which Michelangelo forged, reconstructed. And, he's a Medici disciple. But anyway, we'll get more into that later. So we'll look into the General Dictionary Historical Critical from 1734 and see what Thomas Birch was able to put together as far as more information on this topic. So this is, again, from the 1734 book. This is Scaliger's 38th work. We're on page 4, going into page 5. Scaliger collected in his travels a great number of inscriptions, which he gave to Gruder, advising him to make his great collection of inscriptions, printed in the year 1602 in folio. Scaliger added some short notes and an index divided into 24 classes, which cost him 10 months' labor. Monsieur Leclerc observes that if it appears surprising that so great a man should undertake so laborious a task, and which seemed so much below him, we ought to consider that such indexes cannot be made but by a very able man. To succeed in that task, it is necessary to understand perfectly the inscriptions and know how to distinguish what is peculiar from what is common. Pay attention, and sometimes to illustrate them by some remarks and explain the sense not only of words, of which there remain but one or two syllables, but even of single letters. After Scaliger had finished this index, he wrote the following epigram, and unfortunately, I can only really say this in Latin. I haven't been able to thoroughly translate it in English yet, but it's Sequem dura manet sentenitio judicis olim damnatum erumnis supplicisque caput, huc neque fabrilli lasent ergastula massa, nec rigides vexit fossa mentala manus, lexica contexat, nam cetera quid moror. Omni panerum fasces hic labor unus habit, which is basically him saying that, oh, craftsman, not the master of the man, yada, yada, yada. Someone has to do this work. That's kind of what I got out of it. If someone knows Latin and is willing to be helpful, I would love to send that to you and we can work on it together. So let's go a little deeper into Grüger. I decided to go and look him up inside the dictionary and see if Thomas Birch had written an article about him, or maybe if it went even further back to the original, which is this English translation is sourced from, which is from Pierre Bayle's Le Dictionnaire historique et critique, which was printed, I believe, at the end of the 1600s into the early 1700s, which is basically a critical dictionary criticizing Morière's dictionary, which came out just before his, of which he was very critical of all the blunders and mistakes and errors he found throughout. And he decided to make a massive dictionary, which I can't comprehend how one man could ever do on his own. It's absolutely fascinating how well read and how many notes are in there. So Scaliger drew up the indexes to Janus Gruterus's Corpus Inscriptionum. Now that's what we were just discussing up above there. This is from the article by Pierre Bayle. So under the footnote E, one of the most useful works published by him, that's Gruterus, is a large collection of inscriptions. But here follows the history of this work, and this is important, quite interesting. Martin Smidius, a native of Bruges, spent 6 years in traveling through every part of Italy in order to collect inscriptions, and having added them to those which were communicated to him by some learned men, he digested them in very good order. Marcus Laurinus, Lord of Watervliet, a great lover of antiquity, desired from him a copy of those inscriptions, promising to reward him in a proper manner for his pains. Whilst Smidius was engaged in this work, his house was set on fire, which consumed all his furniture, as also his inscriptions. About 50 leaves accepted, which he had laid by in a closet. Wow, what luck. He just managed to save some of those in a closet, huh? And it didn't get set on fire. So
yeah, in those old, 1.5 foot thick brick-walled European buildings.
So Laurinus, by entreaties and promises, and that's Lord of Watervliet, encouraged him to restore that work in its first perfection, which was accordingly done. I don't know how, he didn't lost his sources. But after which this noble collection was put into the hands of Laurinus, who, after preparing to retire into France to shun the dire effects of a civil war, took with him his inscriptions and the treasure of ancient metals which Hubert Goltzius had collected with numberless difficulties and at a prodigious expense. But he was plundered of the whole by the English garrison at Ostend. Oh man, what luck. Just keeps going downhill. So he could not have recourse to Smidius a second time, for Smidius, being a Protestant minister in Brussels, had been hanged there by the soldiers. Now Smidius was the first person who originally took the inscriptions, and they were burned in a house fire, but supposedly he found 50 of them in his closet, and then restructured the entire book, gave it to a lord, who then decided to retire to France, who then had all of that work stolen by an English garrison, supposedly. So that's where we're at right now. So
how many times have we seen that story of the, it's like the inverse of the missing text that showed up in the firewood box ad infinitum, right?
This is a song that doesn't end; it just goes on and on.
Yeah, and for the audience who doesn't get that, almost every ancient quote unquote text has been magically discovered in the same fashion. There's no continuation because they fake the Dark Age. What they do is they rewrite the text and then they magically appear somewhere. But it's every single time. It's not like a few here and a few there. I don't know of any that didn't show up like that.
Yeah, that's the greatest excuse for the Dark Ages to say, oh, there was no chain of authority between these manuscripts because for 1,000 years people got really stupid and they didn't want to share that information, and then they just left it all into a musty old dungeon somewhere. And then, 1,000 years later it's found, and they're not forgeries. No, not at
all of Europe were dumb as rocks for a whole 1,000 years. That's what they want you to believe. Yeah.
Not interested in anything, just sitting in their dung hills.
It's like, well, there's a black hole, so that's evidence.
So
lack of evidence is evidence.
Let's get back into this because we're already half hour in and we're on page 6. So
go for it.
So he could not have recourse to Smedius a second time, for Smedius, being a Protestant minister in Brussels, had been hanged there by the soldiers. So Goltzius married his widow. During this interval, Janus Dauza, being sent into England by order of the States. Now, that first quote I said at the beginning of the show, Scaliger wept at young Dauza's early death. So there is a relation there. So being sent into England by order of the States, purchased the manuscript inscriptions of an English soldier and gave it to Lipsius, who printed it with some supplements. Gruder took these inscriptions and, adding to them all those which he had been able to collect with inexpressible pains, digested them, published them in Heidelberg in the year 1601, and was so happy as to prevail with Joseph Scaliger to draw up 24 indexes, upon which that great man bestowed 10 months. So you're starting to come full circle now to that nice little article that Birch gave us. So now, the emperor bestowed great encomiums, which means praise, on this work, and gave Gruder the choice with regard to the recompense he desired. The author answered that he would leave it to the emperor's wisdom and discretion, provided the reward was not to be pecuniary. And upon hearing that there was a design to give him, I just lost my scroll there. Let's see, where was I? Upon hearing there was a design to give him a coat of arms in order to raise the dignity of his extraction in the empire, he declared that, so far from desiring a new coat of arms, he was too much burdened with those which had devolved to him from his ancestors. His imperial majesty was then desired to grant him a license for all the books he should publish. He intended to create him count of the sacred palace, but the monarch dying before he had signed the patent, this affair came to nothing. Gruder was too hasty in making his acknowledgement. Quote, the affair was agreed to by his imperial majesty, approved by the imperial council, and brought back to the emperor, that he might ratify by his sign manual what he had been pleased to order. But his imperial majesty was seized with a fit of sickness and died, a circumstance which commonly puts a period to good actions with their authors. Therefore, the patent which contained the privileges above mentioned, like 1,000 more of the same kind, by being delayed, was left without his imperial majesty's signature, nor ever after produced. For a new monarch is more disposed to begin with bestowing his own favors than to complete those of his predecessors, and being busied in new cares, seldom imagines himself obliged to make good former promises. Thus, Gruder never received this very considerable privilege, and nevertheless, he bestowed the same encomiums, or praise, on the good emperor, as he would have done had he enjoyed it fully, end quote. Now, let's go back to the asterisk I just said there, because it's just kind of funny. We're looking at him saying, the emperor is long delayed and he's sick and yada, yada, yada. It didn't happen, unfortunately, because he suddenly died. So this affair must have been long delayed, since the Emperor Rodolphus II, who is here spoken of, did not die till the 23rd of January, 1612. That is, 11 years after the publication of Gruder's book. So he was so long delayed with sickness for 11 years that he didn't get that, was a count of the Sacred Palace. Is that the, yeah, count, you didn't get to become Count of the Sacred Palace because for 11 years the emperor was sick. So that's the history of those manuscripts, Gruder's inscriptions with Scaliger, all based off of, well, burned manuscripts that don't exist anymore. Supposedly 50 of them which had survived, and then all of it reconstructed by a man who then sells it to a lord who then takes it to France, gets stopped by an English garrison. The garrison takes his work, and then the originator of the articles is hung, so they cannot be remade. And then, later on, Janistausa goes to England, supposedly finds some inscriptions, and we're supposed to relate these inscriptions from a soldier back over to all this work. And then he works with Joseph Scaliger and Gruterus to make these inscriptions, which we now see as being part of the history we now have. So that's how we verify a lot of the data we have there, by burned and non-existent sources. Thank you, Gruter. Appreciate that. Beautiful. So that was from Pierre Bayle, who did a remarkable job in exposing quite a big lie. Doesn't quite say directly, though. It's up to the reader to kind of read it and see it, which is pretty explicitly said just with the data itself. So see, prior to focusing on Gruder and Scaliger, an article for the Fasti Capitolini, which we were just talking about, the source under footnote 11 for Scaliger's place in this history is none other than the modern-day classical scholar and Scaliger expert, Anthony Grafton, fellow of the British Academy, a man, lest we forget our lesson from part 5, is linked to the Warburg Institute. It is here that the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes publishes their journal, and if people are wondering what that journal is, the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes publishes new research of a documentary and analytical character in the field of cultural and intellectual history. The subject matter includes art and architecture, religion, philosophy, science, and literature, as well as intellectual, political, and social life, so basically the broad spectrum of humanities. The journal was founded in 1937 as one of the first publishing projects of the Warburg Institute following its arrival in London, thanks to the help of the Courtauld Institute to bring them over. It was intended as an interdisciplinary forum, more extensive in scope and varied in content than the Vortrage previously published by the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek in Warburg, in Hamburg.
That's an easy short word there.
Yeah, Kulturwissenschaftliche. That's a fun word.
Look at that.
I used to speak German a long time ago, but it's not as strong as it used to be.
Yeah.
You have to continually speak with people to keep that fresh. So referring back to that citation from part 5, Anthony Grafton writes of Varro in his book, The Footnote, such scholars, traditionally known as antiquaries, attacked an immense range of subjects. They tried to establish the precise dates on which major historical events had happened. They reconstructed the religious practices and political institutions, public rituals, and private lives of their ancestors. Men like Varro, who wrote on the life of the Roman people he belonged to, were the intellectual ancestors of those legendary, broad-gauge social and cultural historians who flourished in the 20th century Strasbourg and Paris, Mont Blanc and Lucien Febvre. It is not easy to say what ancient antiquarian books looked like, since very little of this learned literature has survived, except in the form of quotations or epitomes. But it seems almost certain that it included not only coherent texts, but also considerable amounts of primary source material, because primary source material comes in quotes and epitomes, and not from the source itself. That comes from secondary sources, tertiary sources. That's anyway. So the antiquarian.
Well, if you use tertiary sources, that's like some people think that's like better. You don't want to, check the primary sources and see if it's like the claims are actually substantial. What's that?
Yeah. You check the authority of the authority.
Right. Yeah. Ad veracundium. That's always the way you want to go. You don't want to look at the primary citations. You want to appeal to authority.
First you follow that a priori fallacy, and then you follow that up by solidifying it on appealing to an authority that supports that a priori fallacy. And there you go. So, the antiquarian genre sprouted new buds in the 14th and 15th centuries and bloomed outrageously in the 16th and 17th. Scholars scoured the cities and countryside of Europe for Greek and Roman inscriptions, which they assembled in notebooks and, from the early 16th century on, published in more or less faithfully printed collections. More or less faithfully printed collections. Like, just hide those little nuggets right in there, you know? So Carlo Sigonio, Onofrio Panvinio, and others restructured the whole chronological spine of Roman history on the basis of the fasti, or inscription, found in the 1540s in the Roman Forum. They were reassembled by no less an artist than Michelangelo in the Palazzo Conservatory. And we're supposed to look on that like it's something to be admired and not something to be questioned.
Right, yeah. I mean, you know,
a great artist did it, so nothing could go wrong. We'll appeal to his authority.
it's like never once do they pull a primary citation and appeal to that and then save the primary citation for posterity, right? You know, it's like, oh, you know, we got a bunch of bullshit right here and we're going to wrap it around and, you know.
So this chronological spine of Roman history is that of Varro, or so it is claimed. Varro's supposed chronology was an attempt to determine the exact timeline of Roman history, inscribed on the Arch of Augustus, an arch that no longer exists.
What page are we on now?
We're on
8?
page 8 going into 9.
Okay.
So inscribed on the Arch of Augustus, an arch that no longer exists, this Fasti Capitolini is said to have the dates set forth by Varro in his chronology that sequences the consuls of the Roman Republic. According to the Wikipedia entry, this chronology has been, quote, demonstrated to be somewhat erroneous, but has become the widely accepted standard chronology, in large part because it was inscribed on the Arch of Augustus. So let's look again upon the citation relating to the, quote, restoration, unquote, of the Fasti Capitolini. And we're regurgitating some stuff, some details from part 5, but it's important to kind of say this again as we proceed through this presentation. So the Fasti Capitolini, a modern name assigned because they were deposited in 1547 in the courtyard of the Palazzo dei Conservatori on the Capitolini Hill, on order of Alessandro Farnese, who kept them temporarily in his villa after the excavation from the Roman Forum in 1545 or 1546, funded by Farnese. Michelangelo, who designed the complex of 3 palaces on the hill, also restored the tables of the Fasti. Now it's redundant, I said that already today, but who is Alessandro Farnese? He's an Italian cardinal and diplomat and a great collector and patron of the arts. Was the grandson of Pope Paul III, who also bore the name Alessandro Farnese, and the son of Pierluigi Farnese, Duke of Parma, who was murdered in 1547. He should not be confused with his nephew, Alessandro Farnese. That's a third one there. Governor of the Spanish Netherlands, grandson of Emperor Charles V, and great-grandson of Pope Paul III. It's quite the bloodline there.
Oh, man.
So Michelangelo, the art forger. So as we discussed in part 5, I recently sat down to watch the film F is for Fake by Orson Welles, a film essay exploring the topic of forgeries and fakes in art, biography, and film. One scene depicts the foremost art forger of the time, Almir D'Ori, painting an original portrait of Michelangelo, afterward signing the piece with a perfect forgery of Orson Welles' signature. So I'm going to read a little bit of the transcript because it's from that scene because it's quite important. So Orson Welles starts off by saying, "It's pretty, but is it art? Well, how is it valued? The value depends on opinion. Opinion depends on the experts. A faker like Almir makes fools of the experts. So who's the expert? Who's the faker?" And then it leads into Almir D'Ori saying, "I know one thing. I never offered a painting or a drawing to a museum who didn't buy it. They never refused me. Never." Which Orson Welles says, "What's he up to now? This isn't a forgery. No, not this time. This is a portrait by Almir of another famous art forger. Michelangelo no less. Signed, I must say I'm honored. My signature, forged by Elmire on a real Elmire, is really something. You know, art forgery used to be admired as an art. And though Michelangelo even used smoke on some of his fakes to antique them, like some of the rest of us, and that's Wells referring back to himself, he finally went straight. Unfortunately, you watch the video and Orson still plays tricks inside of that film because he can't help it.
You know, and for those who want more on how bad Orson Welles was a fraud and agent working with the OSS and Princeton Radio Project, etc., go back and see my episode on Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds from Halloween 2015.
Yeah, that was awesome. It's a great episode. Everybody should go back and watch that one.
Yeah.
So Michelangelo, he was a protege of Lorenzo de' Medici, leader of the Florentine Republic, and patron to the Medici Empire. He had some of the finest instructors living under him to train such men as Michelangelo. In spite of such a resume, Michelangelo struggled for money early in his career. As a result, he resorted to forging classical sculpture and artificially aging it. One such piece was sold to the Roman Catholic Cardinal Raphael Iario. Upon realizing that he had been duped and recognizing the obvious talent of Michelangelo, the cardinal invited the young artist to Rome. And this is how the story begins of Michelangelo.
Faking all of the antiquities in Rome, you mean?
Yeah.
You know, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like there were all these masons involved in masonry, and they would probably fake statues and stuff that were really poured because they were made out of cement like masons do, and then those masons knew the secrets of masonry and the Freemason. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
Yeah, it's almost like...
For sure would explain all the Disneyland rocks at Angkor Wat and at Stonehenge and, Machu Picchu and all the other phony baloney they feed everybody, right? All the fake spiritual, New Age spiritual sites that were created lock, stock, and barrel in the 1940s and 50s.
And then with that, the whole psychedelic drug movements that we kind of linked into last episode as well that lead into your research, and then all this just keeps on going. It's like, builders, they're Dionysian artificers.
Pretty soon you have Daniel Pinchbeck doing 2012 New Age rituals at the Maya pyramids.
All right, so where are we here? We're on page 9 going into 10?
Yes, sir.
All right, we're almost halfway. So
buckle up, ladies and gentlemen.
Now that we've kind of made the setup here of Varronian chronology and a lot of the foundations of where Scaliger is starting to get his ideas of ancient history from forged inscriptions and, Varronian chronology. That's basically what we're seeing here, forged inscriptions and a forged fasti. That's what I wanted to say, a forged fasti. So let's look into Joseph's chronology. So his first book on this was Opus de Emendatione Temporum, which was printed in Paris in 1583. The last edition of is the best, which is Tertia Editio ex Auctoris Manuscripto Auctior and Castigatior. I hope I didn't release some demons by saying that. The work contains a vast extent of learning, and there are observed on occasion of it 3 things peculiar to Scaliger. The first is that he was, and now I'm reading from the 1734 dictionary from Thomas Birch. Okay, this is from a long time ago, almost 300 years ago. The first is that he was the first who undertook to form a complete system of chronology, or to lay down sure principles in order to digest history into an exact order founded on these rules. Before him, no person had ever attempted anything of that nature, so that though he is mistaken in many points, he is highly to be commended for having broken the ice and shown, at least in general, what method was to be taken to make a complete and methodical chronology, which is not the attempt of a vulgar genius. The second is that Scaliger, having a great skill in the Oriental languages, as well as of the Greek and Latin, and a prodigious knowledge of all kinds of writers, has collected everything that he could find in the Eastern and Western authors, which might serve to establish sure principles of chronology and to fix the time when diverse remarkable events happened. Though from this astonishing heap of materials collected from different authors, Scaliger had not formed any regular edifice. Yet it must be owned that the world had great obligations to him for collecting them. And I believe now they're probably all sitting in the University of Leiden, where his protege, Daniel Heinsius, at one time was the head librarian. And I have some interesting tales of him not letting people in that library to read certain books. Hopefully I can get into that at some point. So the third thing to be applauded in Scaliger is the invention of the Julian period, excuse me, which is of vast advantage since it contains certain marks for the distinction of times, without which all the labors of chronologers would be almost useless, or at least very knotty and difficult. He was so prejudiced in favor of this work that he imagined he had carried chronology to so high a degree of perfection that his determinations would be irreversible. But the sciences do not arrive at perfection all at once. And Petavius the Jesuit, in his book De Doctrina Temporum, has discovered many faults in his work. He pretends that the whole doctrine of Scaliger is false and full of contradictions. When Scaliger, says he, first published his book De Emendatione Temporum, the vast extent of learning throughout that work, the incredible variety of things but little known, of which he treats, the novelty of the subject, and the decisive manner in which he speaks, raised him a prodigious reputation. And as it was not easy to examine his doctrine, the public chose rather to think it well-grounded than to undertake difficult examination of it. Now let's read that again. In which he speaks, he raised him to a prodigious reputation. And as it was not easy to examine his doctrine, the public chose, as it was not easy to examine his doctrine, the public chose rather to think it well-grounded than to undertake difficult examination of it. Now, what does that say to you? It says, well, you're a smart guy, and there's a lot of work there, and I don't have time to check it, so I'm not. Sure, you're right. That's how the general public generally, that's how they receive that. So, but returning back to this. However, the same author, publishing a new edition of that work 15 years after, these in 1598, made an infinite number of alterations in it, and often maintained the direct contrary of what he had done in the first edition. Besides, in his isagogical canons, which he represents as a proper introduction to his book, De Emendatione Temporum, he destroys a great part of what he laid down there. What is still worse, according to Petavius, is that these alterations are not better than his first thoughts, and sometimes even less tenable than they. Scaliger is likewise censured for want of method and not expressing himself sufficient perspicuity, which then leads into his the Source Temporum, which we just kind of discussed a little bit. Then his next book, Elenchus, and this is Latin, so I'm going to butcher it horribly. Elenchus Vitriusque Orationis Chronologica Davidis Parai. This is close to his death. He died in 1609. This is 1607. And this is hilarious. So Dave Perius, professor of divinity at Heidelberg, having found something to censure in the chronological calculations of Scaliger, raised the resentment of our author, who could not bear contradiction, and who published this answer, in which he treats Perseus with so much contempt that the latter, imputing this severe way of writing to the study of critical learning, and so much in fashion, told his son one day that the devil was undoubtedly the author of that kind of learning. So Scaliger's trash talking was so severe that he decided to use his sophistic rhetoric in his classes for critical learning, and then told his son one day that the devil was undoubtedly the author of that kind of learning. see this guy over here talking trash and lying all the time and spinning and all that stuff? That devil made that man.
Yeah, I mean, well, from the perspective of Logos, that's obviously true, right? Because
it follows.
Yeah, exactly. But you have to understand Logos to understand that point. That
If you can't handle the truth, you probably shouldn't be trying to work in that field. You're gonna be contradicted from time to time. As a scholar, you need to be able to accept that when it happens, and find that there's probably room to grow from that and learn more. So, not always a bad thing.
There's not too many real scholars out there, though. Most of them are blowing smoke up people's rear ends. I love the whole fields of archaeology and anthropology and ethnobotany. I mean, these fields are mostly just filled with hacks and frauds.
Yeah, I was thinking the other day about, and if I were back in university and I decided to become a history major, how infuriated I would be, because I would want to sit there and check all the sources and go back. And all I would be doing is being rushed to read these, secondary books, and then accept the authority of the authors because supposedly they were all checked, and then write my papers based off of that instead of always going back to the primary. It'd be really frustrating. I'd be spending a lot of time in the library angering my professors. So it'd be fun in some ways, I guess. You could write the anti-paper. So
what page are we on?
We're on page 11. So now we kind of set up Scaliger's chronology. We're going to look into some specifics about how we look at the ancient past and some of the blunders that Scaliger associates with this. This one specifically, we're going to be going into story time now. We're going to be going through a lot of citations and really kind of understanding the issue that we're experiencing now as we look at where our history is coming from. So Joseph Scaliger falsely supposes that Euripides and Plato went into Egypt together. And this is from an article by Pierre Bayle on Euripides. And I'm going to start off with just a very light painting of the canvas to give you an idea of who Euripides is. And then from that, I'm going to follow into the really good stuff, the citations in the footnotes. So Euripides, one of the Greek poets who excelled in tragedy, was born the first year of the 75th Olympiad in the island of Salamis, whither his parents were retired, a little before Xerxes entered Attica. There is a dispute concerning their quality or condition, some declaring them to have been of a noble and others of a plebeian family. Because, hey, he's either really poor or he's a noble family, Who knows? But this guy's a great man, a great poet, but we don't know his history. But some people think he was rich, some people think he was poor. All right, fine. So this great poet was near 75 when he left the world. The circumstances of his death are variously related, which is interesting. So we don't really know how he died. He never was with Plato in Egypt, notwithstanding the assertion of Tanaquil Faber. And if you remember from part 5, Faber is the Latin root for artisan, craftsman, architect, creator, maker, artificer, forger, and smith. I can't hear you. It's completely silent.
It looks like we lost signal for a second. It looks like it's back. But yeah, we dropped signal for a second. Sorry, I just wanted to pause you, but go ahead. Just go back like 20 seconds or 15 seconds.
Well, should I just? I could just go right over into Euripides again.
All right.
In case people missed it.
All right. Yeah, we're not sure exactly what was cut off, so just go ahead and repeat that. Sorry.
All right, so I'm going to paint a canvas of Euripides to give an idea of who he is before we jump into the good stuff in the footnotes. So Joseph Scaliger falsely supposes that Euripides and Plato went into Egypt together. So Euripides, one of the Greek poets who excelled in tragedy, was born the first year of the 75th Olympiad in the island of Salamis, whither his parents were retired, a little before Xerxes entered Attica. There is a dispute concerning their quality or condition, some declaring them to have been of a noble and others of a plebeian family. So we're seeing a dispute already in his life. Only a couple sentences in, we don't know if he comes from a noble family or from a poor family, which is a huge contradiction. Which is it? Unfortunately, we don't know, but we're supposed to ride on with it and just go with it. Okay, go with it. So this great poet was near 75 when he left the world. The circumstances of his death are variously related, i.e., we don't really know how he died. So he never was with Plato in Egypt, notwithstanding the assertion of tanquil faber. And if we remember from Scaliger Part 5, faber is the Latin word for artisan, craftsman, architect, creator, maker, artificer, forger, and smith. Forger. There are now extant but 20 tragedies writ by him, though he had composed 92. Okay, but we don't have those, so we can't really verify that it really was and not just some fable that was written or something that was transcribed incorrectly down the line playing telephone. So let's look at footnote S. He never was with Plato in Egypt. Authors are not agreed upon the year of Plato's birth. But we may fix it very safely to the 88th or 89th Olympiad. I would not advise any person to contradict Mr. Barnes, who asserts that Plato was but 17 when Euripides went into Macedon. Remember, appeal to authority of Barnes. And but 20 when Euripides died. How absurd is it to say, as Diogenes Laertius has done, that Euripides accompanied Plato in his voyage to Egypt? Excuse me, I needed to get an exclamation point in there. How absurd is it to say, as Diogenes Laertius has done, that Euripides accompanied Plato in his voyage to Egypt? Had they gone thither together, it would have been just and decent to have placed Euripides, then a venerable old man, as the leader, and Plato, at that time a very young man, following him as a disciple, much after the same manner as young English lords and young counts of the empire travel over the Alps with tutors. But to leave this incongruous absurdity of the asserting that Plato and Euripides traveled together in Egypt, Euripides left Athens, teased to death with the satirical taunts and jests of the comic poets, and went, being about 72 years of age, to Archelaus's court. It is very certain that his journey into Egypt is not posterior to that of Macedonia. His journey must therefore have been a mere chimera, or must have preceded the 72nd year of Euripides. Now it cannot be denied but that this poet, during his 5 or 6 years which preceded the journey into Macedon, lived in his native country. He exhibited Orestes at 69 years of age. He received in Athens at 67 years old the thanks of those who had lived their lives in Sicily by repeating his verses. Is it natural to imagine that he should attempt to go into Egypt at 70 years of age? And if this absurdity will go down with some, I would ask how it could be possible for Plato, then not 20, to accompany him into Egypt, since he did not go thither till after the death of Socrates, which happened some years after that of Euripides. He, in a word, who did not undertake to go into Egypt till after he had seen Italy, and who did not leave Athens till he was 20 years old. Though Diogenes Laertius should swear to the journey in question, he would not deserve to be credited against the clear and solid reasons which are brought from chronology. With much more reason ought such a fable to be rejected, since he relates it only from hearsay. And yet we see Joseph Scaliger, Tanquil faber, and Menage strongly persuaded that Plato and Euripides went together into Egypt. I don't pretend to excuse Diogenes Laertius, for when a hearsay is evidently false, a writer ought not to publish it without contradicting it at the same time. Laertius furnishes me with a proof against his hearsay. He observes that Euripides fell sick in Egypt, and that the priest cured him by sea medicines, which made him say sometime after, quote, "The ocean every human ill removes," end quote. In the 1193rd verse of the tragedy of Iphigenia and Taurus, which was prior to the 69th year of Euripides, since that tragedy of Orestes, which he exhibited at 69 years of age, was the last piece written by him in Athens. His journey into Egypt must therefore have necessarily been prior to his 69th year, and thus Plato must have gone into Egypt before he was 14 years of age, which is absurd. The learned men of England were not so easily imposed upon as those of France, and did not say, like the great Scaliger, quote, "Plato Eudoxus and Euripides went together into Egypt, learnt the course of the stars from the people of that country, and were the first among the Greeks who instructed their countrymen in this. Plato and his Timaeus, Eudoxus and his, it's a book in Greek script, Euripides and his Thyestes, such are the great Scaliger's words in his notes on Manilius's sphere. They don't say, as Taniquil Faber, that Euripides, after having learned rhetoric from Prodicus, went into Egypt with Plato, there to enjoy the conversation of the priests of that country, who in that age were a little more renowned for their learning than the priests of Spain or Italy. There was an interval of about 30 years between Euripides learning rhetoric and the birth of Plato. The circumstance aggravates Taniquil Faber's error. So there we see Joseph Scaliger, although it's quite obvious, even among the scholars at the time, his contemporaries and people who followed just a little bit after, that what he was relating was absolute bullshit. So how much of these lies were not caught? And how many of them were that were still sent down the river? How much of this poison is still being sent down? So it's an interesting thing to think about, and it's another point of investigation, which I'll have to go down and look at. But what we're seeing now, though, as we look at Scaliger's chronology, is he doesn't really know much at times, and his error is quite severe. And not only that, but a lot of the history, especially the further back we go in the ancient history, some people don't agree on what exactly happened. So if people don't agree on these circumstances, why do we always propose them as truths?
Right. Why rest so much on Scaliger's chronology? Unless there's an agenda, because all other scholars have been pushed under the rug from the same era for this guy who is apparently entirely incompetent. He's either a complete fraud or he's so incompetent that he would be an utter laughingstock.
We just look at the earlier episodes. We were talking about how he handled the history of his family, and you can kind of see it's quite dodgy. And there's probably a whole other episode I could do about that information as it relates to Julius, but we'll save that information for another time because my notes are probably about 20 pages on their own for that so far. So just to point to repeating from the article, for when a hearsay is evidently false, a writer ought not to publish it without contradicting it at the same time. So there should always be little asterisks when we're saying that these things are not certain. Always point out that this thing is not certain as hearsay, or it's not agreed upon. Here are the sources. This is where we go. I'd like to see a little bit more of that. And maybe as the trivium expands out there, more authors will decide to cite their sources properly. So we're going to look at another article that kind of exhibits some of these blunders in history and trying to accurately date a subject. This one's a fun one. A lot of people are going to really recognize who this is. This is Helena and Troy in the view of chronologers. Scaliger's criticism upon Eusebius with regard to the age of Helen, erroneous. And this is from the article by Pierre Bayle. So first, again, I'm going to start off by just painting a little bit of picture of who Helena is, some of the circumstances, and then we're going to dive into the footnote, which really details the timeline and Scaliger's part in this. So Helena, a daughter of Tyndarus, king of Lacedaemon, was the most beautiful woman of her age, but otherwise without the least honor or virtue, and her whole life was full of unhappy adventures. There are some authors who give so particular an account of the perfections of her body that they cannot be excused, even when they say in express terms that they only did it by way of amusement. All the world knows that Helena was stolen away by Paris, the son of Priam, and that all the Greeks interested themselves in the injury done to Menelaus. Hence sprung the Trojan War, so much spoken of by all the poets. Paris, having lost his life the last year of that war, his brother Deiphobus supplied his place with Helena. The Greeks killed him in a cruel manner the night in which Troy was taken. They were favored in this by Helena as much as they could wish. If the authors, and then we're going to go extend a little bit further in here, if the authors who have spoken so much of her have been good chronologers, her beauty must have lasted a prodigious time. And it must be said that the Greeks and Trojans fought with each other 10 years for the possession of an old woman. This would make them very ridiculous. But they would not fail to be so, though we suppose her mistress of all the beauty ascribed to her by the poets. See in Herodotus the value which ought to be set upon a woman who suffered herself to be run away with. Some say that she had only daughters. Others affirm that Menelaus had 4 sons by her. They speak likewise of a son whom she had by Achilles. She had by Menelaus the fair Hermione, and by Paris a daughter who was named Helena, and whom Hecuba put to death. So let's look at these authors and chronologers. So if the authors had been good chronologers, her beauty must have lasted a prodigious time, which is ridiculous. It is said that Helena and Castor sprung from the same egg. We may therefore reasonably suppose that Helena was a woman grown when the Argonauts went to Colchos. For her 2 brothers, Castor and Pollux, distinguished themselves in this famous expedition. Let us suppose her 20 years old at least. That is not too much. Let us not take advantage of the mistake of Eusebius. I shall speak of it below. Let us take the most exact chronology. There are reckoned about 30 years between this expedition and that of Troy. Helena was therefore 50 years old, more or less, when Paris stole her away. The siege of Troy continued 10 years, and it was in the last year of that siege that Agamemnon and Achilles quarreled. We must fix in the time succeeding this quarrel the admiration with which the counselors of Priam were struck at her divine beauty. And I pulled out the citation of this. It says, I observe that the descriptions which have been made of her beauty do not give us an idea of it equal to what we form from reading a passage in the Iliad, which have nothing of a description in them. Homer only introduces the counselors of Priam, who saw Helena coming while they were deliberating upon the affairs of state with their prince, saying, that neither the Greeks nor Trojans were to be blamed for suffering so many evils for so divine a beauty. Quote, they cried, no wonder such celestial charms, for 9 long years have set the world in arms. What winning graces, what celestial mien. She moves a goddess and she walks a queen. And that's a translation by Pope. So returning back to citation S. Here is Helena, therefore, at 60 years of age, forcing by her extraordinary luster of beauty a whole senate to confess that she deserved that 2 powerful nations should ravage each other for 10 years out of regard to her, a 60-year-old woman. Is this not very wonderful? Paris being killed some time after, there arose a very warm contest between his brothers, who should marry his widow. Priam ordered them to try the issue by a combat, and promised her to him who should gain the victory. Deiphobus fought the best of all, and had Helena given to him. Let's see. One of his brothers was so enraged at being excluded that he left Troy and contributed his utmost efforts to the ruin of his country. Does not this prove that at the age of 60, Helena was still the prodigy of beauty? Lucian proves that at the time of the siege of Troy, she was an old woman, and almost as old as Hecuba, i.e., quote, for I saw a woman with a white and long neck, so that one might have conjectured her to be born of a swan. But she was an old woman, and almost as aged as Hecuba, end quote. She would have been much older than Hecuba, if it were true, as is said, and that's by Diodorus Siculus, that Hercules was the last child of Jupiter. Our astonishment at so aged a beauty would cease if we could believe what is related, that Helena, by a peculiar prerogative, was exempt from the severe necessity of growing old. But this is not generally allowed. It is said that Helena, towards the end of her life, as often as she saw herself in her glass, or mirror, sought for herself there with amazement, and complained of time, or Chronos, which had been her 3rd ravisher, and had stolen Helena even from Helena herself, end quote. I have read this in the book of a Jesuit whose style is very affected, and that's Father Lemoyne's Pemetrus Morales. Another modern author relates this almost in the same manner. Quote, she, whom you speak of, deserves to be regarded with such an eye as yours. You will soon see there another change very opposite to that. And he speaks of an ugly old woman who has become beautiful, which has given you so much admiration.
Are we on page 15 now?
Yeah, we're on page 15.
Sorry. Yeah,
okay.
Try to read out the page numbers because that helps a lot.
Yeah, I keep forgetting. I'm sorry. A few years, let's see, where was I? Was given so much admiration. A few years will make you remark this. The same that made Helena weep at her glass and obliged her to call time her third or fourth ravisher, for the number is not certain.
Strange. You get that all of this, sorry to interrupt you, you get that all of this is mythology. Like two countries at war for 10 years over a pretty 60-plus-year-old woman.
Yeah, the myth doesn't match the timeline at all.
Yeah, well, nor the actions, right? I mean, it's like it becomes ridiculous, you know. It's absurd. So how many people died over some hot chick, right?
Yeah, you go look at the Brad Pitt movie, and then you look at what actually it was some 60-year-old woman that they were fighting over for 10 years. I mean, goodness gracious.
Yeah. It just doesn't play out. Find the hottest 60-some-year-old you can find, and then, you know, tell two countries to fight over her.
Not going to happen.
Not going to happen.
I mean, especially at that time. I mean, could she even bear children at that point? I mean, I think they even questioned that up above in this article.
Yeah. Well, Well, you know, I mean, back then, under special certain magical circumstances, like specifically to Helena or Yelena, whatever, you know, we're supposed to believe this line of rhetoric, right?
The whole tale. We just have to take it all.
Yeah.
It. So we're nearing Scaliger's part in all of this. We're about a paragraph and a half from it.
Woohoo! All right. So
sorry for the preschool story time here, but I think it's really important that we hear this. I hope it's fun to hear it and interesting. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So a few years will make you remark this. The same that made Helena weep at her glass and obliged her to call time her third or fourth ravisher, for the number is not certain. A strange kind of rape in which we see Helena stolen from Helena herself, and her, whom 3 parts of the world, which were the whole at that time, acknowledged for the most beautiful woman of the age, seeking her face in a glass, which represented to her nothing but what was frightful. So again, she looks in the glass and thinks she's been raped by time and she's ugly. Everyone else, at the same time, is fighting over her because she's the greatest beauty in the world at 60 years old. So this thought is very like that in 2 verses of Ovid, which I will not butcher in Latin.
Please don't. Just see, if people want to read that, it's like right there. There they go. Now they can. Yeah. Now we can just skip right past it.
I'll start with that. Okay, so I ought to remark that if we follow the chronology of Eusebius, we shall find that Helena had lived above a century when Paris stole her away. So she was over 100 years old when 100-year-old beauty taken by Paris. For according to Eusebius, the expedition of the Argonauts was 89 years before the taking of Troy. He saw plainly the misconception of the Greek writers, upon which he proposes this objection to them. Quote, if Castor and Pollux were among the Argonauts, how can Helena be thought to be their sister, who, many years after being a virgin, was stolen away by Theseus? Consider well the remark of Scaliger upon this Latin passage. Quote, in the Greek, it is thus, who not many years after being a virgin was taken away. By the error of the transcribers, or more probably by the hurry of St. Jerome, it has happened that the negative is not expressed in the Latin translation, and the sentence is rendered absolutely ridiculous. For the more remote the rape of Helena was, the more credible. On the other hand, the nearer it was to those times, so much the more remote from the siege of Troy, and therefore it is less credible that the age of Helena fell into this period of time. Faults of Scaliger. That's your bail. That's him saying that. So this criticism appears to me to be very erroneous, and the more I examine it, the more I am surprised. I do not deny, but that the negative particle, the suppression of which is an error of St. Jerome, according to Scaliger, may make good sense. But I cannot comprehend that the sense would be ridiculous by suppressing the negative. On the contrary, Eusebius's objection seems more intelligible to all sorts of readers without the negative particle than with it. Now we're on page 16. Eusebius's design is to prove that those who have asserted that Castor and Pollux, the brothers of Helena, were in the Argonautic expedition, and that Theseus stole away Helena when she was young, have been inconsistent in their chronology. If Castor and Pollux, says he, were of the number of the Argonauts, how is it possible to suppose that they were brothers of Helena, who was stolen away young by Theseus many years after? The most stupid readers perceive the force of this objection without having occasion to reason much, and without being obliged to have recourse to anything but the words of Eusebius. But if we suppose with Scaliger that Eusebius expresses himself in this manner, if Castor and Pollux were of the number of the Argonauts, how can we persuade ourselves that they were the brothers of Helena, who was stolen away young by Theseus a few years after? Everyone sees that in order to discover it to be an objection, we ought to remove from before our eyes the words which contain it, and to have recourse to the reasonings and calculations which we find in the subsequent pages. For if we consider only Eusebius's expression, we should imagine that he reasoned ill, and what he urges for proof infers the contrary to his design. Here are some other words of Scaliger, which do not appear to me just. And see, and this is ab hoc tempore, and the citation for 125 says, that is, from the number 756 of Eusebius, but I am surprised that Scaliger did not observe that Eusebius had before spoken of the Argonautic expedition under the number 746. So it's kind of surprising to him, and it doesn't appear just. So says he, this is Scaliger, quote, from this time to the destruction of Troy, there are 79 years, so that Helena must have been a very old woman, if the Argonautic expedition happened at this time. For if Castor and Pollux were of adult age, Helena must have been fit for marriage. If the Argonautic expedition be fixed here, at the destruction of Troy, Helena must have been above 120 years.
Maybe they're talking about a constellation. Couldn't be the stars, you know.
No.
couldn't be mythology written on the stars. That's a stretch.
No, it's ancient history.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh! Thanks for correcting me on that.
We can't agree on what it is, but it's history. So
yeah, well, thank goodness that Scaliger and these clowns have set us straight in the Bernays family.
Bernays comes up again in this one.
Well, we haven't even gotten to mention Wasson yet, so I don't know. I had to throw it in there somewhere.
So let's see, where was I here? This is what Eusebius objects, and that justly. So, end quote.
If there were 79 years, says Scaliger.
If there were 79 years, says Scaliger, between the Argonautic expedition and the destruction of Troy, Helena must have been above 120 years old at the taking of that city. What consequence is this? Is it worthy of the great Scaliger? Is it necessary that a woman should be above 40 years old, that we may say with propriety, she is fit for marriage, matura viro? This is the expression of the author, who I am confuting. He has succeeded much better in his criticism upon Eusebius's calculations, for it is not true that the Argonautic expedition and that of Troy were so distant from each other as Eusebius imagines. but it is certain that Eusebius has followed very eminent writers, and consequently, very eminent writers, so appeal to authority, and consequently, I might maintain that if the ancient authors who speak of Helena had been good chronologers, her beauty must have lasted a prodigious while, even beyond a century. Let us consider...
I just got something to say to this, because my family lives a long time in general. Like, I had several aunts that lived well over 100, 103, 102, 105, and when my Aunt Margaret died at 105, she wasn't pretty and supple, I mean, it was kind of like, I don't know. It wasn't, it wasn't like a description of a, 15 years senior Helena.
There's a word right on the tip of my tongue.
No. I won't go there. That's kind of gross.
No, I'm not thinking of a gross thing. I'm thinking of what is a thing that happens over time as you decay. It's not decay. It's
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like it smells like decay. Someone who's 105 years old doesn't smell so morning fresh.
Well, why can't I think of the term? It's like right there. It'll come to me eventually. I'll come back to it if I think about it. I don't want to stall the show anymore.
Somebody says decay.
No, it's. I just had it. Goodness, it's like right there. I can see the word, and I just can't grasp it. It'll come.
Yeah,
to me.
you can just see armies of people falling over a 120-year-old crusty.
I want to say it's like entropy. That's it.
Oh, yeah.
There we go. Okay, now I have that. Good. All right.
Now you can move on. You got it out. You're saved. Your mind has been freed.
I didn't have to look it up, which generally you're supposed to do. So let us consider a little of the computation which Clemens Alexandrinus borrowed from Apollodorus and some other celebrated historians. In one place, he tells us...
just really quickly, the women in the chat group are arguing that the definition of beauty must have changed over time, and this explains it, and why people would have been warring for 10 years over this. I mean,
It's their beautiful personality.
Right, yeah. To get people, two nations to war for a decade and kill who knows how many.
It's a beautiful soul. Oh, goodness. I'm sorry. So I was reading some of the other footnotes, and I didn't include this in here, but goodness gracious, there's actually a story of her breasts being molded in gold. I didn't put it in here because I just thought it.
How old was she when they were?
Well, so everybody arguing about her beauty. No, they really supposedly.
Yeah, somebody says Helena the Moon. That's funny because. In Serbo-Croatian, moon and breasts, sika, sisa, it's like interchangeable,
Oh man, and if I could think of the imagery of how they described what those golden cups would have looked like, there's something about rotten grapes at the end. But anyway.
Oh, okay, all right, let's go on, please, come on.
But then 120-year Helena.
Yeah.
So,
okay, yeah. Thanks, ladies, for arguing your point that they must have changed what beauty means.
We had Jacob go into more on Helena.
Wow, yeah. We, let's not take the emotional response route again for this show.
So where are we here? We're just 16 going on into 17. Let us consider a little the computation which Clemens Alexandrinus borrowed from Apollodorus and some other less celebrated historians. In one place, he tells us that there were 38 years from the time when Hercules began to reign at Argos after the expedition of the Argonauts to his deification, and that Castor and Pollux were deified 53 years after Hercules, about the time of taking Troy. This is reckoning 91 years between the Argonautic expedition and the destruction of Troy, and making Helena 100 years old, more or less, at the time when Paris stole her away as a perfect beauty. In another place, the same father makes a computation by which there are 68 years between the rape of Helena by Paris and the Argonautic expedition. So now we looked at some computations of history, which requires a skill in mathematics and textual analysis and checking your
What
sources.
page are we on now? Sorry.
We're on page 17. We're going to go into Joseph Scaliger, the mathematician, quadrature theory. So he wrote a book in 1594 under the title Cyclometrica Elementa Duo Nec Non Mesolabium. Like an Ash versus Evil Dead for a second there. Sorry. I was hoping the Book of Dead didn't open up. So it's interesting is I have this book right here. It's the Scaliger collection. It's all the works of Scaliger and all the works about Scaliger, all in here. And it talks about, and it was sold at auction at one point. It's a massive collection. And they have a brief description of a lot of the works that he has in there. There's a lot of really interesting information, especially when it comes to Cyclometrica Elementa Duo. So Anthony Grafton, a fellow of the British Academy, and I can't remember his first name, but his last name is De Jong. They write the references and stuff in this book. They're the editors. And Grafton explodes them here. It's pretty brilliant. So Scaliger's work on the quadrature of the circle, in which he contends that Archimedes is
Sorry, somebody just made a wisecrack that the Golden Fleece is on sale at Bed Bath and Beyond. That was good. All right, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, it's Funcat 7. I see that.
Yeah. All right, no more wisecracks. Craps. Keep it on topic, everybody.
All right, so from the Scaliger collection by Anthony Grafton.
Oh.
Scaliger's work on the quadrature of the circle, and we'll get into the description of what that is as we go further here. Just
sure.
As we go. So, on the quadrature of the circle, in which he contends that Archimedes' calculations are incorrect. It would permanently damage his standing as a mathematician, and such inconsequential assertions as both pi equals the square root of 9.72 and pi equals the square root of 10 evoke reactions from the great French scholar Vieta, from the Orientalist J. Christman, and others. Scaliger was to ridicule Vieta with a cyclus, in which his name was anagramized as Cur Asinus Faciet, which is essentially calls him a donkey, pretty much. Maybe more like an ass, but I did a rough translation of it. Didn't get deep into it. Let's see here. So anagramized as Cur Asinus Faciet. So the whole affair was to remain a touchy one. And when E.G. Perezek met Scaliger, he did not dare broach the subject in his presence. And when Heinsius published a letter by Scaliger on the subject, he discreetly replaced the title and subject by asterisks. And remember, Scaliger died in Heinsius' arms before he lifted up into the great, whatever they said in that, whatever Patents has said about that. He was a student of Bernays. Anyway, so Heinsius is a student, and he was also the head librarian. And he discreetly replaced the title and subject by asterisks on this letter relating to Scaliger and quadrature theory. So he suppressed it a little bit. Obviously, scholars were able to find it and dig it back up into truth, but for a time it was born in uncertainty. So the Cyclometrica has a dedication dated January 1594 to the States General of Holland, in which Scaliger offers the first fruit of his studies after his convocation to the Low Countries. The Mesolabium, dated 1594, is dedicated to the curators of the Leiden University and offers a very flattering comparison of the academic quietness and quality of the town of Leiden with the rest of Europe. The printing of both works is striking because of the red color printing applied to all the woodcut diagrams, to the letter references in the text, and to the headings and the running titles. So it's pretty interesting. That must have cost a little bit of extra money there to add that colored ink into there, especially in that color of blood. So the mathematical theorems are all first posed in Greek, as if it concerns an authentic old work. But the Greek is Scaliger's. Repeat that. The mathematical theorems are all first posed in Greek, as if it concerns an authentic old work. But the Greek is Scaliger's. Then follows the Latin translation, an exposition, and where necessary, a scholion. So the appendix, published in December 1594, has no dedication. And then the preface to the reader shows Scaliger in a singular position. In 4 long passages, he defends himself against accusations of stupidity for errors in his cyclometrica, which he cannot deny. And he craves for the indulgence of the reader, contending that as a mere mathematical amateur, he should be forgiven certain obvious errors, in sharp contrast with the proud and overbearing attitude he adopted when introducing the cyclometrica earlier that year. The printing, as in he was really lifting himself up as a great man who is, going to change the world. And I'm just an amateur. Excuse my mistakes, but they're not all mistakes. So the printing also is more modest. So, you got taken down a peg. So no red printing. The theorem is no longer first in Greek, and the expositions now in smaller italics. But Scaliger cannot refrain from ending his work with a poem in which he heralds his future glory against contemporary detractors. See for this whole affair, Bernays, page 188 to 180. So there we see he stood fast to that and right down to the end. So he couldn't bear the fact that he was wrong about a theory, which is technically impossible. So let's look at a mathematician.
Because how could Scaliger be wrong about something he made up?
Not only that, but he wrote it in Greek with the auspices of trying to be an ancient author, but he got caught on that. So,
so if he was caught once, we're to believe he didn't do it any other times, Dennis Patavius et al.
Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice.
Yeah, and then there's, I don't know, like a few, this is going really out there for a lot of people, and they'd be shocked to hear this notion, and I think you and I may have discussed it once before, the potential that ancient quote-unquote Greek and Latin were actually created in the Middle Ages.
That's a theory I've heard. I haven't quite fully investigated it. I think we talked about it at one point. That's something that hopefully, as I go further into learning about the language, the manuscripts, the history, and the sources and where they go, more certainty can be put about that. But that's definitely something that's conjecture without much foundation at this point. So it shouldn't be taken as something we're saying as certain.
But it's a serious inquiry, and somebody else actually raised the notion to me yesterday or day before, maybe, and it's maybe the 5th or 10th time it's come up in my mind, and I think Fomenko argues the same, if I recall.
Yeah, I've seen some arguments from that, and also in some forums related to his research. So I don't have the grammar right now where I could really give a meaty discussion about it, because it's something that's a point for more investigation for me. But a curiosity, and
because when you look at all of this stuff, Latin and how it's all canonized and a dead language, and then the Kaisers, Caesars, czars took over and ruled everything, and all of this, it makes this official history that we've been told fairly wobbly, to begin with. Just knowing that the Kaisers are the Caesars are the czars creates a massive problem in the entire official history. It's like the whole, Caesar's Messiah theory. It's like, so the Khazars created a theory against the Khazars and only applied it to other Khazars.
Wasn't that book sourced on Eusebius that we were just talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I'm sorry, did I give it away already?
No, I was just thinking about that for a second, because a lot of that history comes from Eusebius, and we're seeing a lot of errors of Eusebius.
Yeah, and then when you realize the whole fake, how the whole history is fake to cover over Tartary, then it creates a whole other massive problem. Don't look up Tartary, ladies and gentlemen. Do not research Tartary.
Yeah, if you just do a simple Google image search, oh my goodness, you find old maps of it all over.
Yeah, don't do it though. Don't look. They're gonna, that'll spread and wake everybody up, and everybody will realize their real heritage real fast. So.
Yeah, there seems a lot of information hidden in plain sight. I can't wait to do more information on that. I have a lot of grammar about that, but we still have to do a Grand Tartary party at some point. But
yes.
We don't want to diverge too far here.
We'll do a Grand Tartary. We'll be doing a Raising the Phoenix party soon.
So let's go back to the quadrature theory.
Sure.
And let's kind of look into, so what is quadrature? What is quadrature? And so let's ask a mathematician. And
you mean Fomenko?
Yeah, let's see what Anatoly Fomenko has to say about this.
He is by golly, he's a professor of mathematics at Moscow State.
Yeah. So not to appeal to authority, but we are kind of seeing something here, and he also backs himself up with citations. So it's not appealing to him; it's more.
Unlike some of these others who don't even read work before they can claim to attack it.
So let's look at what he has to say. So, all right. And he starts off with this by spelling Joseph with the I, because at that time there was no J that existed. So Josephus Scaliger, for instance, could not even conceive of such heresy as running a check on the chronological materials of the Holy Fathers, that's Eusebius and others. Quote, Scaliger calls this work by Eusebius divine, and that was in Eusebius Pamphilus Ecclesiastical History from 1848. Trusting the authority of their predecessors unconditionally, the chronologists reacted at external criticisms very bitterly. The same Josephus Scaliger makes a perfect demonstration of this attitude toward objective scientific criticisms in the following episode. Quote, the eminent philologist Joseph de Scaliger, the author of the chronology that has received such high scientific acclaim, turned into a keen quadraturist. So let us remind that a quadraturist was someone who tried to build a square equaling a given circle or a disk in area. So a square equaling a given circle in area using nothing but a pair of compasses and a ruler. Where does this compass and ruler come from again? Is that masonry?
Well, by golly, I think you're right.
Wow, that's weird. Okay, so by a compass and ruler, you can solve quadrature. So this mathematical problem is insoluble as a principle, which is proven by geometry. However, Josephus Scaliger had published a book where he claims to have proved the true quadrature, which solved the problem. The best mathematicians of the epoch, yet Clavius, have tried their hardest to prove to him that his reasoning was incorrect, all in vain. The point here is that Scaliger's erroneous proof made the easy corollary about the perimeter of an equilateral polygon with 196 angles being greater than that of the circle circumscribing it. So I'll repeat that again. See, Scaliger's erroneous proof made the easy corollary about the perimeter of an equilateral polygon with 196 angles being greater than that of the circle circumscribing it, as in going around it. So you go around that 196 angle polygon with a circle. What happens is you look between all those little angles and you see more area. Okay, so that's our mathematician, Scaliger. Where was I here now? So nevertheless, quote, Scaliger and his supporters, oh, I'm sorry, I think I missed something there, being greater than the circle circumscribing it, which is naturally quite absurd. Nevertheless, Scaliger and his supporters, who had a habit of defending their opinions vehemently, didn't want to acknowledge anything, replying with maledictions and scornful epithets, and finally calling all the geometricians complete ignoramuses in what concerned geometry. And that kind of thinking, my friends, is something that's born of the devil. The last part was me quoting from earlier. That wasn't Professor Fomenko that said that was the devil. So one might imagine how these people reacted towards attempts of analyzing their version of chronology critically. And I actually gave that example with Perseus, who called him the devil, who actually experienced that when he criticized some of his chronology. Oh, okay. So the retaliation of Scaliger against those who accuse his father of ignorance in mathematics, and of which Scaliger falsely accuses Bodin of plagiarism. And this is another article by Pierre Bayle, and this is from Bodin. This just kind of shows that, he fancied his father as a mathematician as well, and then also lies about plagiarism, which is hilarious. So there's as much hyperbole in the praise that Gabriel Nada gave to him as injustice in the contempt which Cujas, Scaliger, and some others have shown him. Just a brief aside, I wanted to do more about this guy, but I haven't had the time. Cuja was Scaliger's teacher. Cuja taught law. He would not bear being interrupted at any point during his lectures, and if anybody ever questioned him, he would end the lecture and walk out. So that's the kind of man that taught Scaliger, was a man who did not take criticism very well and made all of his dissertations off the top of his head and never had any notes or citations. And the same Cuja supposedly had a massive library, and upon his death, in his will, had all the books scattered all over the place. So all these old and ancient manuscripts and other stuff that he had lost. We don't know where they are, who has them. So the chain of command that supposedly existed there died with him. So that's Cuja. And he is a huge,
a hot-headed fraud. It sounds like,
and a major influence on creating international law and a lot of the laws we see now in Europe and the United States and stuff. It's thanks to that guy. So what Scaliger said of Bodin was very disobliging. Quote, Bodin falsely accuses my father, Julius Scaliger, of ignorance in the mathematics, though he is very unlearned himself and very jejune, having transcribed whatsoever learning he has gained for many years out of other men's labors, nay, out of my book upon Varro, De Lingua Latina, of which the most impudent thief has taken whole pages for his own and heaped them in a manner into one chaos, writing many things which he does not understand himself. Lastly, he wrote a book of the method of reading history, in which he treats of nothing less than the subject, so that his discourse does not at all agree with the title, as various Flaccus observed on Cato's Origines, which treat of nothing less than the antiquities of Italy. But if anyone will write against him, I will furnish his matter for him, for I do not think it any honor to me to have anything spread about in my name. So here's what Pierre Bayle has to say about that. So you see, he calls him, i.e. Bodin, very ignorant, and thought it a dishonor to confute him. What arrogance! And how ill it becomes a man of letters, though it is very common amongst them. Let us appeal from this judgment of Scaliger to that of Thuanus, and if we will dispute with John Bodin the character of an exact and judicious writer, let us leave him without controversy a great genius, a vast knowledge, and a prodigious memory and reading. The works from which he drew his glory stood in no need of borrowing from a commentator on Varro. They are not of a nature to obtain any honor from that quarter, and there is room to believe that Scaliger and Cuja were not capable of producing what he did at the States of Blois with so much force. So there you go. Bayle's like, well, he didn't actually plagiarize you at all. And so he made this big old big load of steam trying to dishonor a public intellectual for criticizing him. And like what you see, lies. So the legacy of quadrature theory among Renaissance humanists. This is from the article Orontius Phineas by Pierre Bayle. I'm just going to paint a little brush of who this guy is, and then we're going to go into his take on quadrature. So Finet, in Latin Finau, Orontius, professor of mathematics in the Royal College at Paris, was the son of a physician and was born at Briançon in Dauphine in the year 1494. The first works by which he made himself known was his publishing and correcting John Martin Silesius's arithmetic and the Margareta Philosophica. He reads afterwards private lectures on the mathematics, and then he taught that science publicly in the College of Gervais. He acquitted himself of that function with so much reputation that he was recommended to Francis I as the most proper man to teach the mathematics in the new college, which that prince founded at Paris. He omitted nothing to support the glory of his profession, and though he instructed his scholars with great assiduity, yet he found time to publish a great many books upon almost every part of the mathematics. He boasted that he had found out the quadrature, or squaring, of the circle. So Samarthanus asserts that Orontius Phinae boasted without reason that he had found it, and that Providence designed that glory only to Joseph Scaliger, i.e., quote, amongst his other volumes, he wrote a particular book in which a great many persons had labored in vain. I'm sorry, did I skip a line there? He wrote a particular book in which he boasted that he had found out the quadrature of the circle, after which a great many persons had labored in vain. He was easily inclined to believe this of himself, being conscious of his great learning, though a kinder fate designed the glory of that admirable discovery to Joseph Scaliger alone, end quote. So Samarthanus is in the right to say that Orontius Phinae boasted without reason that he had invented a method to square the circle. But he is strangely mistaken when he pretends that Scaliger is the only person who discovered that secret. For it is so far from being true that this privilege was designed for Scaliger alone, that it may be asserted this great man was farther from it than several others, i.e., nobody got to it. None. It's impossible. You can't do it. So, excuse me, I'm starting to lose my voice, but thankfully we're getting near the end. We're on page 20 going into 21. And this is going to be the final little bit of this presentation. We're going to look into the academic dictatorship of Joseph Scaliger at the University of Leiden and his influence. This is from an original article by Thomas Birch, fellow of the Royal Society, in the 1734 General Dictionary, Historical and Critical. He's also the author of Joseph Scaliger's biography. Pierre Bayle did not make a biography, but he still indexed him quite a bit inside the book. But the Scaliger biographies are all Thomas Birch. So we're going to read about another man, another chronologer. His name is Cephas Calvisius. And I'm going to do something here. I'm going to read pretty much his entire biography. It's not too long, because at the beginning, in the middle, and the end, all seem to have a pretty important information. And then from that, we're going to go into the most important part, which is his chronology. So Calvisius, a celebrated chronologer in the beginning of the 17th century, was born in a village called Gorschleben near Saxelburg in Thuringia on the 2nd of February, there must have been a footnote there. So February the 21st, 1556, of honest parents, though in a very low circumstance. His father dying while he was very young, his mother gave him as good an education as her circumstances would permit, finding that his genius led him to learning, though some persons would have persuaded her to put him to a trade. He went to Franchus at 13 years of age, and 3 years after he moved to Magdeburg, in both which places he supported himself chiefly by singing from door to door with others of his companions, and by this means saved money enough to maintain himself in the University of Helmstadt. After he had lived 7 years at Magdeburg, he went to Helmstadt in 1579, and the year following removed to Leipzig, and was appointed chanter in the illustrious Schola Portensis ad Salam in November 1582. In this station, he applied himself to the study of history and chronology, and laid the foundation of that great work of chronology, which he afterwards finished at Leipzig. Having continued 11 years and a half in the school above mentioned, he was chosen by the Senate of Leipzig, Thomas Birch is an interesting way of writing that I just can't quite read. So having continued 11 years and a half in the school above mentioned, he was chosen by the Senate of Leipzig as governor of the choir of music in the Schola Thomua in that city in May 1594. In this province, he distinguished himself to great advantage by his skill in music, his diligence and success in the instruction of the youth in the school, and his uncommon knowledge in the most abstruse parts of astronomy and chronology. He wrote several excellent treatises upon music and compiled a thesaurus of the Latin tongue for the use of the youth. His writings gained him so great a reputation that several universities and states made him very considerable offers to settle among them, particularly the University of Wittenberg, which offered him the professorship of mathematics, and that of Frankfurt, which proposed to him honorable conditions. Excuse me. But he preferred his humble and laborious station at Leipzig to the most splendid titles in other places, and lived in a very frugal and modest manner. And I'm kind of seeing a little bit of a mirror of Joseph Scaliger right there, which is quite interesting as far as how they lived their lives, supposedly. He married Magdalene, the daughter of John Uningen, a citizen of Leipzig, February the 10th, 1595, by whom he had 3 sons and 1 daughter. One of his sons died in his infancy. Our author died at Leipzig, November the 23rd, 1615, with great sentiments of devotion, and was interred there the 27th of the same month. Besides the work above mentioned, he published at Erfurt, 1610, in Fortio, a book about Jesus Christ, and I'm not going to read the Latin, it's just too much. And in 1612, Elenchus Calendari Gregoriani and Duplex Calendari Melioris Forma.
I thought you said you weren't going to read it.
This is the second book. I have to read this one because this is the actual book that he wrote on chronology. So in this Elenchus, he proposes 2 points. First, to explode the Gregorian calendar by the principles of astronomy, and next to point out a truer and more convenient form of a calendar. Our author is reckoning among the heretics of the first rank in the Index Expurgatorius, published at Madrid in 1667. Now, the Index Expurgatorius is basically a banned books list made by the Catholic Church. You also notice that if you wanted to explode the Gregorian calendar, and if memory serves me correctly, and I'm just lifting something off the top of my head, I believe Professor Flamenco at one point detailed a dispute of Joseph Scaliger in relation to the Gregorian calendar. But specifics aren't quite there yet. On the top of my head. It's not too important, just something there. So Calvisius' family history is of his own account within the prefix of his book of chronology. So the only history we really have of his family comes from him, unfortunately. So we really don't know much more. Calvisius, in addition to being a genius in music, astronomy, and ancient history, is also a master of the Hebrew tongue. Quote, he continued in his laborious employment almost 12 years with that fidelity, diligence, and success in the instruction of youth, that he was universally approved. He published there a tract upon music, which was greatly applauded, and besides music, he taught likewise in the school the elements of the Hebrew tongue. So let's look at Calvisius' chronology.
What page are we on now?
We're on page 22.
All right, thank you.
We're almost there. 5 more pages left, or 4.5.
Only 40 minutes, folks.
Well, this should go much faster because the ending is mostly exposition.
All right, just try to skip through the red stuff because we're already over 2 hours here.
Yeah, skip over all the good stuff. So
no, I said just go read the red stuff is what I'm saying.
So let's see. While he lived in the illustrious Schola Pratensis, where he enjoyed a good deal of leisure and a large library, he applied himself to history and noted down the particular periods of the most considerable events, but was not able to draw up a system of chronology till Joseph Scaliger's book, De Emendatione Temporum, was reprinted at Frankfurt in 1593. Upon this, he read over and examined that work with great attention and compared it with all the chronologers whom he could procure, and inquired into the reasons of the several disagreements in chronology. At last he found that all the certainty of it depends upon the laws of astronomy, and that those chronologers who neglect astronomical calculations have fallen into the most palpable mistakes. For this reason, he undertook to explain in an obvious and popular method what Scaliger had performed with greater subtlety and abstruseness, and he examined all the several epochas with the utmost accuracy, inquired into the grounds of their certainty, confirmed them by proper demonstrations, and solidly and clearly refuted whatever might be objected. This cost him a prodigious deal of labor, since he was obliged to calculate above 150 eclipses. That is, all that were mentioned by the historians.
And we can see when you're going through Flamenco's work that somebody must have known that and gone through and tried to calculate things as well as they could by the eclipses,
Oh yeah, that's where a lot of the information comes from. As you go back in time, you're seeing that even the Renaissance humanists at that time didn't think of them as like some sort of like a fable or something like that, but as a documented fact.
Right.
So we're seeing that right here, as we're seeing a Renaissance humanist and a chronologist and someone who's a contemporary at the beginning of writing these chronological tables doing just that. So, grammar. So, let's see. This cost him a prodigious deal of labor, since he was obliged to calculate above 150 eclipses. That is, all that were mentioned by the historians, supposedly, in order to determine the times of the particular events. He drew up likewise astronomical tables by which the equable motion of the moon may be easily discovered with regard both to the longitude and latitude, so that by these tables any person, though ignorant of astronomy, may certainly affirm that the eclipses mentioned by the historians to mark out a particular event happened at the time assigned. To these he added the precession of the equinoxes and solstices, and several other tables, and showed by tables or the most certain rules how any epocha may be rightly compared with any other, which was never done by any chronologer before him. He added to all these a chronology from the beginning of the world to his own time, in which he inserted the history of all ages, described by such circumstances that even children might comprehend in their minds a continued series or synopsis of history. When he had finished this work, he determined to publish it at the persuasion of his friends, upon which he delivered it to the professor of history at the University of Leipzig for his opinion, who, having kept it about a month, at last committed it to Dr. Muir, the mathematical professor, for his judgment, because there were a great many astronomical calculations in it. The history professor couldn't figure out. Dr. Muir, having examined it, declared that the astronomical calculations were right. Calvisius thought the whole affair was now concluded, but it happened otherwise. For the professor of history, resolving to suppress this chronology, had recourse to the governors of the university to prevent the publication of it, since nothing is suffered to be printed there without their permission. He complained, as our author observes in his letter to Joseph Scaliger, dated at Leipzig, January the 4th, 1606. So that's a letter written by Calvisius to Joseph Scaliger, talking about what this history professor was saying. Okay, that's so. Our author observes in his letter to Joseph Scaliger, dated at Leipzig, January the 4th, 1606, that there were a great many innovations in it, contrary to the received doctrine, that several weak arguments were made use of, that the youth would be thrown into confusion by it in their studies, that Calvisius had usurped another man's province, since he was not the professor of history, and by such arguments as these he prevailed upon the governors of the university to prohibit the impression of it. Our author wrote the above-mentioned apology to the governors of the university, and that was all in Latin. It's too much to translate, and appealed to others and offered to demonstrate his scheme by astronomy. At last, after the academical council had been called several times, he gained his cause, not so much by the suffrages of the judges as by the favor of some persons, who were for following Gamaliel's advice in this point. Such was the influence that his antagonist's authority had over many of them. Dr. David Perius, professor of divinity at the University of Heidelberg, remember him, he called Scaliger a devil, and Elias Rosener, professor of history in the University of Jena, and John Kepler, the celebrated mathematician, wrote against this work of our author. So here, Perius was a critic of Scaliger's. Now he's also a critic of Scaliger's, I guess you'd call him a friend, but Scaliger influenced Calvisius, and now he's writing against this. And it's harder to say than it should have been. So they criticized this, but without any considerable success. It was highly approved of by Joseph Scaliger, as appears from several of his letters. In his 115th letter addressed to Isaac Casaubon, he styles it a most accurate chronicle, accuratissimum chronicon. And in his 117th letter addressed to Casaubon, he says that it is the only work which, after so many ages, was worthy of the title of a chronology, and deserved to be immortal. In his 240th letter, addressed to Richard Thompson, he styles our author a very learned German, though before the publication of his book unknown to him, and observes that his chronology was excellent, being confirmed throughout by Scaliger's reasons, and that he was a very good and learned man, and the first among the chronologers who ceased to trifle, his work being admirable, useful, and full of all kinds of learning. In his 439th letter addressed to John de Laet, he observes that ever since he had published his work with relation to chronology, which had been so long neglected before, no person has spent an hour in reading his books or examining his reasons, till at last Seth Calvisius arose, who was worth all the rest, being an accurate master of that subject, and published a most learned and complete chronology, which entirely depended upon his reasoning, and was an heroic work and worthy of immortality. I'm going to stop there for a second, because remember when we were looking up at Scaliger's work on chronology, they were saying that most people would just read the work and never really check anything and just accept it as is. Calvisius supposedly went in, checked everything, and then tried to confirm it. And he tried to do that through astronomy. So, see likewise his 308th letter. Theodorus Spizelius, in his Templum Amori Resurratum, tells us that our author in this exquisite work has shown so much acuteness and judgment that if he has any equals, he appears to have none superior to him in our age in that science. He observes likewise that Calvisius spent 20 years entirely in this work, which he confirmed by demonstrations in such a manner that his industry is not only highly applauded in all parts of Germany, but also among foreign nations, and that among all the disputes of chronologers, there will not be any one easily found who has shown by astronomical reasoning that our author has been guilty of any gross error. Keep that in mind. So de Gory Ware and his reflections, I'm going to skip over that. So de Gory Ware in his book tells us that Calvisius exerted, it's all in Latin, exerted himself with so much industry in the late edition of his work that he has omitted nothing but given us a true system of chronology in an exquisite manner. Dr. Richard Montague, Bishop of Chichester, in his Apparatus 2, observes that Calvisius was without controversy a man excellently well skilled in chronology, but too fond of innovations. So now here we see that Scaligerian chronology is the foundation piece for this. And from the Scaligerian chronology, Calvisius then takes it and tries to take all these eclipses and dates and try to verify it through astronomical tables. Now, if we remember what we were learning about Professor Flamenco in his book, there's a curious discrepancy with the motion of the moon. So I'm going to read a passage from Professor Flamenco's introduction to his first book on chronology. This is my little title says Professor Flamenco, Harvard, the publisher of Loeb Classics, the Royal Society, and the British Academy. And this is how we're going to close out the show. Excuse me. So the fourth stage, which was the period of 1973 to 1980, commenced in 1973 with A.T. Fomenko, faculty member of the Department of Mathematics and Mechanics of the Moscow State University, was researching several problems related to celestial mechanics. He had noticed the 1972 article of the American astrophysicist Robert Newton, who's of the Harvard Astrophysics Lab, where the latter described a strange leap in lunar acceleration and the so-called parameter d. The leap occurred around the 10th century AD. Using the Scaligerian datings of the writings that make reference to lunar and solar eclipses, Robert Newton computed lunar acceleration as a time function on the interval of the 1st to 20th century AD. So,
what's really interesting here is Fomenko actually exposed Robert Newton's totally flawed logic on this. And then all of these morons all over the internet actually then believed that Fomenko used Newton's argument as the foundation for his work and then attacked Fomenko for what Fomenko had attacked. You know, I mean, the stupidity of these people is just freaking absurd. I mean, you know, they had to get to like, what was it, page 3 or 7 or something like that in the introduction of the book to find this, you know? I mean, these guys are just so utterly incompetent. It's ridiculous, you know?
Yeah, it's absolutely absurd and demonstrates gross negligence, which is...
Yeah, what did Noah Webster call these clowns again?
Sophists or captious and fallacious reasoners.
Captious and fallacious reasoners, right?
Every little detail.
Yeah. These are these guys that go around like basing everything off of the Loeb classics and stuff like that.
Kuhn Lobensson's Thunders of Trotsky. I think
These,
in the last episode.
What do they call themselves? Secret something or other men? Secret
agents?
Secret Asian men, secret ancient men. I forgot. I thought it was secret Asian men. I forgot.
I thought it was agent.
Oh, secret agent men. Got it. Yeah.
Because they're agents. That's the song anyway. So let's see here. Where were we? The leap in question comprises an entire mathematical order and cannot be explained by the gravitational theory in any way. It was the issue of the discussion organized by the Royal Society of London and the British Academy of Sciences in 1972, and one that had spawned major controversy. The discussion had failed to elucidate the situation in any way, and so Robert Newton suggested to attribute the leap to certain mysterious extra-gravitational forces in the Earth-Moon system, or, as I like to call it, magic. That little advert was me. That wasn't Professor Fomenko, because a mysterious extra-gravitational force, so some force more powerful than gravity. Oh, they're not even get into that. They're just so stupid. So then, the half-wits actually took Fomenko's debunking of that and then used that to attack Fomenko, not really realizing that Fomenko had attacked and debunked it. They actually were so stupid that they believed that was that Robert Newton's ridiculous, theory that is discussed right there. They actually, that this mysterious extra gravitational force. They then attacked Fomenko that was the foundation of his work and not debunking of the ridiculous theory. I mean, God, the incompetence of these people is just astronomical, It's either incompetence or it's intent.
I mean, if it's intent, then they're just dirty, scum that hide behind pseudonyms.
Fallacious reasoning.
Yeah.
So, pay particular attention to Professor Fomenko's citation as to what institutions organized this discussion of the article by Harvard astrophysicist Robert Newton about his parameter D. The Royal Society and British Academy are heavily connected in this study, especially in parts 3 to 5. And it is the British Academy that founds the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem under the British mandates in Jordan and Palestine. Sir Frederick George Kenyon, a founding member of both the academy and school, acted as president of each. Fomenko relates, quote, "The one-time director of the British Museum, Sir Frederick Kenyon, categorically insists that archaeology has refuted, quote, the destructive criticisms of the second half of the 19th century. W. Keller even published a book titled, suggestively enough, And Yet the Bible is Right, which tries to convince the reader of the veracity of the Scaligerian interpretation of biblical data." Professor Fomenko goes even further, investigating Frederick's daughter, Kathleen Kenyon. Quote, and she's also a fellow of the British Academy, off the top of my head. "The biblical account of the destruction of Jericho is well known. One of the Arabic settlements in the Middle East had been arbitrarily identified as the biblical Jericho, whose walls were destroyed by the sounds of the horn. The settlement has been subject to thorough excavations since the endeavors of Selin, Watzinger, and Garstang in the late 19th century. There were no results. In 1952, an Anglo-American archaeological expedition led by Kathleen Kenyon, the daughter of Frederick Kenyon, ventured to continue Garstang's research. Garstang, a contemporary of Frederick Kenyon. No justifications for identifying the excavated town as Jericho have been found. Wright wrote, quote, "The information received about Jericho was called disappointing, and it is true. Not only is it hard to interpret the biblical tale of the Jericho, one cannot so much as trace the outline of the tradition's history. The Jericho issue is more problematic today than ever." This is going back to my analysis. One cannot leave this citation without noting that John Garstang began his career joining the team of Sir Flinders Petrie in Egypt, who started the British School of Archaeology in Egypt, I believe, a man infamous for the, quote, discovery of the Merneptah Stele in 1896, of which he claims to be the earliest reference to Israel. The truth of this claim made by Petrie and German Jewish philologist Wilhelm Spiegelberg to this day holds controversy as to the validity of the translation. So let's look at what Wikipedia has to say about this. Spiegelberg, who is a member of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, was puzzled by one symbol towards the end, that of a people or a tribe from a tribe whom Merneptah had victoriously smitten. I-S-I-R-I-A-R? Petrie quickly suggested that it read Israel. Spiegelberg agreed that this translation must be correct. Quote, "Won't the reverence be pleased?" remarked Petrie. At dinner that evening, Petrie, who realized the importance of the find, said, quote, "This Stele will be better known in the world than anything else I have found," end quote. The news of its discovery made headlines when it reached the English papers. While alternatives to the reading Israel have been put forward since the Stele's discovery, the two primary candidates being Jezreel, a city and valley in northern Canaan, and a continuation of the description of Libya referring to wearers of the sidelock. Most scholars accept that Merneptah refers to Israel. They accept it. It's not confirmed. So Garstang soon after carried out excavations funded by wealthy donors in exchange for artifacts. He served as director of the Department of Antiquities in the British Mandate of Palestine between 1920 to 26. And was head of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem from 1919 to 1926. He was funded by Sir Charles Marston, who excavated Jericho from 1930 to 36. Charles Marston was deeply interested, now going to Wikipedia here. Charles Marston was deeply interested in archaeology and became president of the Shropshire Archaeological Society, financially supporting its excavations across Palestine from 1929. Charles financially supported John Garstang's excavations at Jericho, followed by further excavations during the 1930s, by which time he was a leading financial supporter of the Palestine Exploration Fund. Kathleen Kenyon is also associated with that. He also authored two popular works on biblical archaeology, The Bible is True in 1934, followed by The Bible is Alive, 1937. Although not a professional archaeologist himself, Marston was a member of various academic societies, including the Society of Antiquaries of London, where he self-taught himself archaeology and ancient history. He also participated in some of John Garstang's digs at Jericho, alongside financially supporting the excavations. So, after some time, the institution changed its name to the Kenyon Institute, after Kathleen and her father Frederick. Now, that institute is the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem. So we're seeing this chain of command. We don't no longer call it that. We call it the Kenyon Institute. So A.T. Fomenko noted that all the attempts of explaining the gap in the behavior of D failed to raise the issue of the veracity of the eclipse datings that were the actual basis for Robert Newton's calculations. However, despite the fact that A.T. Fomenko was well outside the paradigm of historical research back in the day, he had heard that N.A. Morozov offered some new datings of the ancient eclipses in his work entitled Christ, published in 1924 to 1932. It has to be said that A.T. Fomenko's initial attitude towards N.A. Morozov's work was rather skeptical, and based on whatever random information he had received on the subject during informal discussions with fellow faculty members, i.e. for a time he was skeptical and maybe believed some fallacious reasoning of others off their authority. So nevertheless, having overcome his skepticism, A.T. Fomenko unearthed an astronomical table by N.A. Morozov that contained the new datings and performed a new calculation of the parameter D using the same algorithm offered by R. Newton. He was amazed to discover the disappearance of the mysterious leap and the transformation of the D diagram into an even, practically horizontal line. A.T. Fomenko's work on the topic was published in 1980. However, the elimination of the enigma from celestial mechanics led to another question of paramount importance. What was one supposed to do with the chronology of the ancient times in this case? So I thought I'd leave us off with a quote from one of the earlier episodes on Scaliger, as we kind of noticed something that was happening here, which is we're mixing facts with fiction, and then we're presenting it to our youths and those that are inquiring scholars as truths. And that's a big no-no. And as we can see here under the article for French romances and scarce histories, it is an unhappy thing that Madame de Jardin should have opened a way to a liberty that is daily, and she's a 17th century French author, should have opened a way to a liberty which is daily more more and more abused, which is to father our inventions and love intrigues upon the greatest men of the later ages, and to mix them with matters of fact that have some foundation in history. The mixture of truth and fiction, which is spread in abundance of new books, spoils the taste of young people and makes them unwilling to believe what is really credible. It is an inconvenience which daily gains ground by the liberty that is taken to publish the secret amours, the secret history, etc., of such and such lords famous in history. Booksellers and authors do all they can to make it believed that these secret histories have been taken from private manuscripts. They very well know that love intrigues and such like adventures please more when they are believed to be real than when they are thought to be mere fables. And then I'm going right back to Orson Welles and who's the expert and who's the faker. Hence it is that the new romances keep as far on as possible from the romantic way. But by this means, true history is made extremely obscure. And I believe the civil powers will at last be forced to give these new romancers their option, either to write pure history or pure romance, or at least to use crochets to separate the one from the other, truth from fiction. And there's a little asterisk at the end there from the editors, and they say, what would Bayle say to the multiplication of books of a kindred species within the last half century, which indisputably pervert many youthful understandings in respect to historical facts and characters? This interference of the civil power, however, would only make bad worse. And that's from an edition printed by Hunt and Clark in 1826 of the same dictionary that I've been reading from. A highly abridged one. So that's kind of where the presentation ends. You've seen that the blending of truth and fiction is everywhere as we study history. We see that Professor Flamenco is trying to dissect and expose a lot of that. And Joseph Scaliger gets a lot of things wrong. So that's basically what I'm kind of coming away from this here. It all kind of ties together because it starts back from Coconut Moon, going all the way back down to Scaliger, and then going all the way back, almost back up to Coconut Moon again. Like I haven't gone back up to Thomas Harrison, but a lot of people are associated with mass observation are starting to come into light, especially the Gallants family and Sir Israel Gallants, who's associated with the British Academy, the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, and Sir Frederick George Kenyon and all of them. So it's all starting to come to light here. A lot of the pieces are starting to come together, and I think I'm almost ready to go on to the next stage. I'm not done with Scaliger, but there's more information I need to start following and bring to light because I think I'm ready for the next part now. So I hope everybody enjoyed.
Where do people send their donations and support for your research?
You can send donations to Jacob Duellman. That's JACOBDUELLMAN @gmail.com. That email is linked up to PayPal. If you're feeling charitable, I definitely would appreciate it. It goes towards a good cause as I am going to continue my research. It helps fund books, and hopefully at some point I can also add more to a fund to get a new computer. I already have a little bit saved up, so it's just a matter of getting to the goal.
Who wants to buy Jacob a new laptop and help this out, help this project out? Come on, you all have done it before. We had to buy Kathy a laptop once years ago for coming on the show and all of her research, and that was really helpful and kept her going. And so let's just, maybe somebody can just ship one to your door,
That'd be appreciated, but that's a very generous proposition and one that not many people can make, so I'm not crossing my fingers.
Yeah.
But
and go ahead.
I was just going to say, I totally blanked out. I'm going on 4 hours of sleep, and we had a snowstorm the last couple of days, so I'm pretty...
All right, and please donate to the Gnostic Media website. I appreciate all the support as well. It's a lot of work getting this stuff back on. Somebody says, get Kathy back on. So maybe we'll do that sometime. She's been on a couple of times. But thanks, Jacob, so much for all your research and help exposing all of this and helping expose all of the frauds and clowns and incompetence all the way through. It's pretty sad when people latch on to their I guess that's just begging the question argument, circular reasoning, back to what they were taught before, and they can't crack a book that might challenge their beliefs. They're not.
They can't get past their prior beliefs. To see that.
Most people aren't intelligent enough to question their beliefs and move on if they're wrong. They have to stick to the agenda of what they think they know. So let's see. Anything else we should add before we wrap this up tonight?
I'm not really sure. I don't think this will be my last Scaliger episode in general, but I definitely want to get my other projects going. So there's definitely a lot more information I can share about it. It's just a matter of how I can put it together. I'm pretty fried right now. Hard for me to get a lot of information out.
Yeah, well, and that was a long 100th show, so thanks for the great anniversary, the great, what do you call that? I don't know, 100th show.
You're welcome. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. Just if anybody enjoys the work and would like to contribute towards more research, you just email me at jacobduellman@gmail.com, and that's linked to PayPal.
Yes, send PayPal funds. That's very helpful, and we all need it to keep this stuff going and to keep exposing this stuff. So, all right, ladies and gentlemen, good night, everybody. Good night, Jacob. Appreciate your time.
Cheers.
See you next week, and we'll have more good stuff then. I think Dr. Hans Utter is back next week to continue our discussion of, what was it, unritualizing ritual or something like that, so.
It was a mouthful.
Yes. All right. Until then.
Thank you. Good night.